Hi there. Chilling the Lobbies welcomes you. Tonight, I'm here to help you unwind. However, if you truly love what I do here, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe before you get too comfortable. Tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you're tuning in from. We truly get the impression that it is a global community. Note that there aren't many advertisements throughout the first 15 minutes. After that, there are no advertisements at all. I sincerely feel you won't find stories like this anywhere else, so I hope you'll give this film a chance. Let's start our evening together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. First story. Dr. Oliver Hartwell initially believed the weeping to be the wind. Story 1. The weeping widow in the drawing room of Saltmere House, surrounded by the mess of school life. He had been unpacking boxes. Manila files filled with ship manifests, leather-bound books on marine history, and photo collections of ships that the sea has long claimed. The light coming in through the large windows had acquired that odd autumnal look beside the sea, and the November afternoon was coming to an end. Thin as ancient paper and pallid. A low keening wail, which seemed to rise and fall in time with the sound of waves hitting rocks, was the source of the sound. Oliver hesitated. He listened to a volume of shipping record from the 19th century that balanced on his hands. Through ill-fitting window frames, the melancholy, unrelenting sobbing eventually faded into what may have been the sound of wind. Naturally, he was aware of the legend when he bought Saltmere House. It had been mentioned almost sheepishly by the estate agent, an anxious woman with flashing eyes. There are stories about the previous owner, about things people said they had experienced, she remarked, her voice falling to hardly more than a whisper. Oliver had grinned back then, the smug look of a guy who lived his days surrounded by facts. He dealt with ship logs and customs records, which are physical proof of lives lost and lives lived at sea, while teaching maritime history at King's College London. Ghost stories were just folklore, an attempt by the human mind to fill in the blanks in history with a story. He had needed Smir House just as much. Large enough to accommodate his growing collection of maritime archives, enough remote for focused research, and sufficiently inexpensive to be covered by his meager academic pay. If anything, the mythology had benefited him by keeping the price low and the number of competing offers low. In a sad manner, the home itself was lovely. Constructed for his bride in 1847 by Captain Ezra Hargrave, it stood out on the Norfolk cliffs like the prow of a ship slicing through the countryside. A unique widow's walk, a railed platform where, according to local legend, ship captains' women would pace and wait for their husbands to return from the sea, crowns the roof of this three-story building made of aged brick and limestone. According to the accounts, Adelaide Hargrave had maintained her vigil night after night, year after year, from this widow's walk, eyeing the horizon for a ship that would never arrive. Captain Hargrave and his whole crew were swept to the bottom of the North Sea in 1852 when her husband's ship, the Cassandra's Dream, was lost in a storm off the Hebrides. Until her passing in 1891, Adelaide had kept watch. Her sanity was slowly eroded by nearly 40 years of grief and hope, until some believed that she had simply vanished, turning into more of a ghost than a woman before death took her. According to the local version of events, she persisted in her vigil. On the widow's path, visitors to Saltmere House claimed to have seen a black figure that was motionless as stone and constantly looking seaward. Others reported hearing a sound so depressing that it brought tears to the eyes of strong men, wailing in the night. The mansion had gone through several owners who never stayed for long, and it had been mostly abandoned for decades. The story of Adelaide Hargrave's restless spirit gains fresh chapters with each departure. Such tales intrigued Oliver more than they frightened him. They stood for the meeting point of collective memory and recorded history. The manner in which retellings of true events elevated them above the level of plain occurrence. As part of his larger research on the psychological effects of maritime loss on coastal communities, he planned to investigate the real-life story of Adelaide Hargrave. Her story would be a perfect example of the mythology that developed around real historical tragedy. He sat in Captain Hargrave's old study that night, looking at the room that would be his main office, and the tears poured again. It was a manly room with heavy furniture and dark wood paneling, with a huge oak desk facing the sea as its focal point. The walls were covered with aged, brown-edged nautical charts that marked shipping routes that had been out of use for more than a century. With its lens cap long since gone, a telescope on a brass pedestal aimed toward the window. The sound felt closer and clearer this time. It had an attribute that made Oliver's heart constricted with empathetic feeling, unadulterated sorrow that seemed to permeate the walls. Under the influence of an impulse he could not fully explain, he found himself getting up from his chair and heading for the window. The countryside was bathed in silver blue light due to the almost full moon. Long since gone, the garden below had reverted to something close to its natural state. The water extended to the horizon beyond the overgrown fence, its surface fractured by white caps that glinted in the moonlight like pearls. And there was a figure standing right above on the widow's walk. Oliver's throat tightened each breath. In the moonlight, she could be seen plainly even though she was maybe 50 feet distant. A lady wearing a long black clothing, her hair pulled back under what looked like a mourning cap, her hands clasped before her, her posture one of endless patience and unfathomable grief. She faced the water in perfect serenity. She held up one pale palm to her face while he watched, almost daring to breathe. The act of a woman wiping away tears that had been streaming down her face for almost a century was sad in its basic humanity. Oliver stayed by the window until the moon was hidden by clouds. However, the widow's walk was deserted when the light came back a few minutes later. That night, I had a hard time sleeping, not out of fear. Oliver was experiencing a profound, unfathomable grief that seemed to have become ingrained in his bones rather than anything as basic as fear. In his dreams, he saw storms and ships and ladies standing by windows, waiting for men who would never come back. His pillow was wet with tears. He didn't remember crying when he woke up. Over the ensuing weeks, the phenomenon occurred again with unsettling regularity. Adelaide Hargrave kept her vigil always at night, whenever the moon was bright enough to light the widow's walk. Oliver started to look forward to seeing her, and as night fell, he found himself pulled to the study window. With the systematic precision of his professional background, he began keeping a journal in which he recorded every observation. November 15th, full moon, clear night. The figure emerged at around 11:47 p.m., stayed in view for 7 minutes. Extreme emotional discomfort is suggested by posture. No communication with the observer. November 18th, declining moon, partly cloudy. Arrived briefly at 12:33 a.m. For a few moments, the figure seemed to be staring straight down at the study window before turning back to seaward vigil. Heavy fog till midnight on November 22nd, followed by bright skies. When the fog cleared, the figure was still there, indicating that she keeps watch no matter the visibility. Stayed till 2:15 a.m. However, he was impacted by more than just the outward signs. Grief seemed to permeate the entire place. Oliver was overcome by waves of unfathomable sadness that would come at any time. Simple chores like cooking, organizing papers, and even reading were emotionally taxing. As though Adelaide's decades of grief had seeped into the walls themselves, the very air seemed heavy with grief. He started to see why the previous owners had run away from the house. Coexisting with such focused suffering was like having a wound that would not go away. Oliver's own emotional condition deteriorated. His continual exposure to supernatural anguish weakened his professional detachment. But instead of alienating him, the encounter made him even more enthralled with Adelaide tales. This was not the stuff of penny dreadful sensationalism or gothic romance. This was the kind of true tragedy that was at the core of all the best historical research, raw human pain made visible. He might be able to assist Adelaide achieve the calm that had escaped her for almost 2 centuries if he could really comprehend her narrative. With new vigor, he plunged into his investigation. Death notifications, marriage licenses, and birth certificates were produced by the Norfolk County Records Office. The loss of the Cassandra's dream and Captain Hargrave's career were covered in length by the National Maritime Museum. Oliver reached out to parish historians, the ship's crew relatives, and anybody else who could have more records of the disaster. The resulting image, in its whole, was devastating. At the age of 23, Adelaide Harcourt wed Ezra Hargrave, the daughter of a successful Norwich merchant who at first saw the benefit of associating himself with the captain's expanding wealth. However, the surviving correspondent indicated that pragmatic factors' real affection had soon replaced it. Oliver discovered their romance correspondence in a Norfolk Maritime Heritage Trust archive, and it was quite moving to read them. Adelaide's meticulous script allowed her voice to be heard clearly. She wrote to Ezra about books she was reading, local rumors that may entertain him on lengthy journeys, and the little household things that would make him feel at home while at sea. She was intelligent, funny, and incredibly compassionate. However, the intensity of their shared attachment was made clear by Ezra's writings. Ezra wrote to Adelaide as an emotional and intellectual collaborator, apart from the stereotypical Victorian husband who could see his wife as a nice housekeeping accessory. He detailed his experiences, solicited her input on business issues, and expressed his thoughts about the areas he visited, vividly enough to imply that he was telling her about them just to make her feel part of his exploits. 3 months after their wedding, the letters started. "My dearest Adelaide, we drove along the Danish coast today, and I couldn't help but think of that afternoon we spent talking about Tennyson's handling of marine themes in your father's garden. Here, the sea has the same gray-green hue that you so eloquently characterized as melancholy beauty, and I fervently hope you can see it for yourself instead of relying solely on my pathetic descriptions." An even more personal picture was drawn by another letter he sent during what would turn out to be his last journey. "I've made the decision that this will be my final lengthy adventure as Cassandra's dream master. The wealth I've amassed is enough to keep us comfortable, yet every time I leave, I find it harder to be apart from you. In my fantasy, Saltmere House will be transformed into the house we have imagined, complete with kids, books, and the sound of her laughing filling over too many quiet rooms." During their brief marriage, the young couple had been wonderfully happy, and their shared ambitions went far beyond simple domestic satisfaction. In order to build a dynasty that would last long after the sea took its final toll on the Hargrave name, they had intended to enlarge Saltmere House and develop a library accessible to local academics. It was nearly unimaginably painful to read these letters while still residing in the home they had shared. Oliver could see them moving through these similar rooms, making plans for the future with the self-assured confidence of those who thought their love could triumph over all challenges. Their dreams had been so clear and attainable that it was tragic that they had been cut short. The loss of opportunity was nearly as terrible as the actual loss of life. In November 1852, the Cassandra's Dream had set sail for Hamburg on what should have been a normal voyage. Unbelieving that it would be her final glimpse of her husband, Adelaide had watched from the Widow's Walk as his ship vanished over the horizon. The North Sea storm that destroyed the ship came as a surprise. An unexpected storm that overpowered even seasoned teams. There were no survivors found. Wreckage was never discovered. Adelaide had experienced complete and instantaneous grief. After learning of the ship's loss, she reportedly remained on the Widow's Walk for days, keeping her vigil in the weather and rain until worried friends brought her inside. But she kept watching even after that. Each night, whether it was raining or not, she would ascend to the roof platform and look for sails that would never be seen. Her vigil became the subject of local mythology as the years went by. At night, kids challenged one another to stroll past Saltmere's residence. On quiet evenings, fishermen said they could hear her crying from the hamlet. However, Adelaide herself grew more and more alone, her universe constricting to the home and the boundless sea that had stolen her joy. Her story touched Oliver's heart deeply. This was true tragedy, the sort of deep loss that rendered scholarly debates about the historical significance seem blatantly insufficient. Adelaide Hargrave had not just been grieving. The thing had eaten her, turning her into a monument to loss rather than a real woman. The frequency and severity of Adelaide's nighttime sightings increased as November drew near. the anniversary of the Cassandra's illusory last journey. Almost every night, Oliver would discover her on the widow's path. He felt his own heart shattering in response to her position, which expressed such depths of sorrow. Her sobs became louder, leaking through the walls of the home until they reverberated in every room. Oliver came to his choice during one of these vigils. Such agony was too great for him to tolerate. Perhaps definitive evidence of her husband's death would finally allow Adelaide Hargrave's spirit to be released from Saltmere House, if her doubt about his fate kept her there. It would not be an easy task. Though there was no tangible sign of Cassandra's dream being destroyed, it had simply disappeared. However, Oliver had spent years searching through the maze and archives of nautical history, including insurance records, if any existed. Admiralty reports that he would discover survivor testimony from other ships. He started with the venerable insurance company Lloyd's of London, which had insured innumerable commercial ships. Even while their archives were vast, they simply provided the information he was already aware of. After an official inquiry into the ship's loss, Adelaide received a considerable sum of £2,000, which was the insurance amount for the Cassandra's dream. The records of Admiral Ty were no more illuminating. After conducting a preliminary inquiry, the Royal Navy merely classified the incident as a marine casualty due to severe weather conditions because there were no survivors or wreckage to examine. The catastrophe was reduced to bureaucratic notation. The case was concluded and the file was sealed. Oliver, however, was tenacious, and in historical study, perseverance was frequently rewarded. He discovered the Prussian Maritime Authority's data after a fortuitous mention in a Hamburg harbor journal. He found the personal documents of a German merchant who had dealt with Captain Hargrave through a cross-reference in a Bremen shipping registry. Oliver discovered the first indication of something surprising in this collection, which is kept at the Bremen Historical Society's archives. For months after the alleged loss of the Cassandra's dream, in March 1853, a letter mentions Captain E. Hargrave negotiating the sale of cargo in Hamburg. According to the author, Heinrich Müller, a spice dealer, Hargrave was still very much alive while traveling under circumstances that necessitated secrecy. As Oliver took a picture of the document, his hand shook. In March 1853, if Captain Hargrave had survived, then he could not have been taken by the storm in November. Why, though? Would he have let his wife think he was dead? What justification could there be for such cruelty? As Oliver dug deeper into Hargrave's financial practices, the solution started to come to light. Beginning with Mueller's letter, he followed a convoluted series of transactions that depicted the captain's last years in an increasingly unsettling manner. Contrary to Oliver's assumption, the Cassandra's dream had not been involved in legal merchant commerce. She had been involved in illegal activity. African gold, Indian opium, and Chinese silk. All of it was obtained in ways that were far from lawful, according to the preserved records. It appeared that Captain Ezra Hargrave had been a pirate. Oliver felt the realization hit him like a physical blow. He was a cold-blooded criminal who had concealed systematic brutality and thievery behind his image as a respectable trader, not a romantic buccaneer from marine romance. The riches that had drawn Adelaide's merchant father was the same affluence that had constructed Saltmere House. All of it was taken from the cargo holds of ships whose sailors had probably perished rather than turn over their goods. However, the most startling discovery was still to come. Oliver discovered Captain Hargrave's own comments in a Hamburg State Archives collection of private documents. A frightening image of deliberate betrayal was constructed in a series of letters to Willem Vanderberg, a business associate. The deception still accomplishes its goal. It was composed by Hargrave in April 1853. No one suspects the truth, and my dear wife continues to endure her useful grief. The police have stopped investigating, certain that I am dead. I am free to finish my business without any legal or familial constraints. 6 months later, another letter was equally clearer. Adelaide's sorrow is the ideal barrier. Who would accuse a deceased man of carrying on with his business? Vigil for the letter keeper. It guarantees the safety of my valuables while I forge forth in uncharted territory. The collection's last letter, penned in December 1853, demonstrated Hargrave's parent's profundity. I made up my mind not to go back to England. The grieving of my wife has become very well known in the area, and it would be inconvenient to refute such a practical myth. The majority of my wealth has been buried on the Saltmere estate, where her vigilant grief will protect it more effectively than any armed guard. Maybe when the time is right, I'll get back what's rightfully mine. Let the grieving widow keep watch till then. Oliver took a seat in the reading room of the Hamburg archive. Like tarot cards displaying an unimaginable fortune, the photocopies of the letters fanned out in front of him. For decades, Captain Hargrave had left his bereaved wife to unwittingly protect stolen treasure after feigning his own death. Generations of onlookers have been touched by Adelaide's vigil, the heartwarming picture of committed love, but had been nothing more than a sophisticated security system created by a cold-blooded criminal. The return trip to Norrall was a blur of startled discovery. But on the lengthy train ride home, Oliver was troubled by more than just the documentary proof. He was unable to stop thinking about Adelaide, the young woman who had written those adoring letters to her husband and who had waited obediently on the widow's walk for a man who had purposefully left her to a life of needless sorrow, not the ghost that haunted Saltmere House. Oliver started to realize the full extent of the tragedy he was looking into as the train took him through the English countryside. There was more to Adelaide's story than just a woman who lost her husband to the sea. It concerned a woman whose whole perception of her life and marriage had been shaped by deception. Her 40-year vigil had been based entirely on deceit. Every tear shed was in vain for a guy who had opted for freedom over accountability and fortune above love. Oliver's increasing apprehension over Adelaide's spirit's potential response to this information, however, was what most unsettled him. During his weeks at Saltmere House, he had worked on the presumption that she would be able to rest once the mystery surrounding her husband's fate was solved and that truth would bring calm. He now pondered whether the truth might turn out to be more destructive than doubt. When Oliver came back, the home had a new vitality, as if it were reacting to his knowledge rather than his presence. He heard the crying start up again above his head as he made his way up the stairs to his study with the portfolio of damaging documents. However, the sound was different. Now, there is less mourning, more urgency, and less sorrow than frantic investigation. Surrounded by the proof of Captain Har's treachery, Oliver spent the evening in the study attempting to comprehend the full ramifications of what he had found. Euphemistic references to prizes won and barriers cleared abound in ship reports. Correspondence describing the sale of pilfered goods in ports throughout Europe. Financial documents demonstrating the methodical transformation of wealth obtained from piracy into legal investments. And all the deliberate aloofness with which Hargrave had spoken of his wife's pain. In his view, Adelaide had been little more than a tool, her sincere sorrow acting as a diversion from his actions as he made a fresh start in foreign places. She had truly loved him. As long as it suited his illegal objectives, his performance was maintained. Oliver realized more and more that he was not the only participant in the study as he went through these records. The ghostly force that had been watching his study for weeks was now more intense and concentrated. The weight of Adelaide's attention was palpable to him. Her intense desire to comprehend what he had learned was pressing on his awareness with such urgency that it was hard for him to focus. Oliver had been keeping a close eye on the clock since midnight, as though he was recording the moment when the truth would be exposed. He heard footfall on the widow's walk above, but they were deliberate, coming down from the roof platform toward the main body of the house, rather than the pacing that had marked Adelaide's earlier appearances. Adelaide's footsteps sounded on the stairs for the first time since Oliver had arrived at Saltmere House. Oliver was pulled to the window once more as midnight drew near. The moon was bright enough to illuminate every feature of the countryside, and the night was clear. He expected to see the familiar silhouette of Adelaide as he glanced up toward the widow's walk. As usual, she was present. However, something had changed. Adelaide Hargrave was not facing the sea for the first time in his weeks of observation. She was standing at the widow's walk railing, but her gaze was fixed on Oliver watching from the study window. He could see that her posture had shifted even from this distance. The sagging posture of unending grief was no longer there. She held her head high and her shoulders straight. Her demeanor had a sense of purpose and passion that chilled Oliver's blood. She held up one pale palm and pointed at him as he watched. The connotation of the gesture was clear. Somehow, she knew in whatever. Adelaide Hargrave had discovered the truth about her husband's treachery, and she was pointing not in condemnation, but in awareness of the realm's spirits inhabited. Oliver didn't interrupt her vigil. The truth she had been hiding for nearly a century had now been revealed by his ally. Something considerably more horrifying had taken the place of the sobbing that had marked her appearances for so long. Adelaide Hargrave smiled as Oliver gazed up at her. It was a disagreeable expression. It was the grin of someone who had been eagerly awaiting justice and was now prepared to get what was rightfully his. Oliver's heart pounded his ribs as he staggered backward from the window. As he rapped on the desk, the portfolio of papers strewn all over the floor. Letters from Captain Hargrave, mingling with insurance papers and shipping manifests. One document in particular struck his eye as he knelt down to collect the papers, his hands quivering. On what looked like a page ripped from one of Hargrave's logbooks, a map was hand-drawn, with its distinctive sites that Oliver recognized from his regular strolls around the property. The shoreline was unmistakably the region surrounding Saltmere House. His breath caught, however, at the symbol that was marked in the garden. A tiny X next to what the map identified as the old oak. Oliver was familiar with the tree. Ancient and twisted, with a big trunk that was easily 6 feet in diameter, it stood in the middle of the natural garden. On pleasant afternoons, he had frequently sat beneath it and read documents under the canopy's dappled shadow. The markings on the chart indicated that Captain Hargrave's wealth was buried right under its roots. The implications struck him like a blow to the body. Adelaide hadn't been keeping a somber watch for her deceased spouse. In order to prevent anyone from disturbing the location where Hargrave had concealed his illicit profits, she had been keeping watch over stolen gold. However, she hadn't been acting in this way out of allegiance to her illegal spouse. She was waiting for the truth to be revealed, waiting for the world to realize the true nature of her husband, awaiting the chance to get the retribution that had kept her going during decades of apparent grief. Oliver had heard weeping, but it had not been grief. It had been a sound of anger so sustained and pure that it had taken on the rhythm of mourning. For more than a century, Adelaide Hargrave had nourished her rage with the memory of betrayal, sustaining it with pure willpower until it grew stronger than death itself. She was now aware that Oliver was aware. The secret was out. She no longer needed the meticulous act of mourning that had long guarded her husband's wealth. Oliver had last looked out onto a bright evening, but thunder roared overhead. He went back to the window, not afraid of what he could see. Suddenly, as if in response to some mystical call, the sky was filled with dark, rowing clouds that appeared out of nowhere. Within their depths, lightning blazed, illuminating the terrain at intervals. Oliver heard footsteps above, but the widow's walk was now deserted. The steps were slow and deliberate, following the same route Adelaide had taken for many years. But no longer observing the sea, back and forth. Her vigil was finally over, and she was now pacing like a predator in a cage. There was a small jarring in the study door, which Oliver was positive he had closed. The sound of tears filtered through the opening. Now, however, things were different. It was the dreadful weeping of someone whose anger had at last found its target, not the despairing tears of sorrow. The roar was reverberating around the house, becoming closer every second. Oliver seized the portfolio off paperwork and retreated to the study's far corner. What he was feeling could not be true, his logical mind insisted. That hallucinations were being caused by psychological stress and persuasion. But his rudimentary brain, the part that had survived ages of real danger for his ancestors, was urging him to flee. The ground floor was reached by the footsteps. They now walked slowly and purposefully down the corridor toward the study, making a rustling sound with each step. The sobs persisted, interspersed with phrases Oliver could hardly comprehend. Charges in a loud voice filled with decades of repressed rage. The door to the study opened. Oliver realized at a way why Adelaide Hargrave had frightened so many guests at Saltmere House as she stood in the doorway. She wasn't a kind soul yearning for a past love. She was wrath that had persevered through the breakdown of flesh and bone to follow its target across the line between life and death. Vengeance given form. Her black mourning attire was the uniform of a soldier who had never given up the field, not the graceful Victorian mourning outfit. And passion too pure and horrible to be kept inside human features contorted her pale face, which Oliver had seen as ethereally beautiful from a distance. Dear God, the anger that had collected over a century was burning in her eyes. Her voice carried the sound of waves breaking over drowned men's bones, the sound of wind blowing across cemeteries. You know, she murmured, but the words didn't seem to come from her throat, but rather from the home itself. You are aware of his actions against me. Oliver struggled mightily to find his voice. I am aware of the treasure, yes. He never perished in the wreck, as far as I know. Adelaide entered the room, her feet silent on the flooring, yet her presence radiated evil in every nook and cranny. I kept an eye out for him for 40 years. I maintained faith with a deception for 40 years. He allowed me to stand on that platform for 40 years, looking out over the horizon for a ship that would never arrive. In distant ports, he lived, loved, and laughed. You found out, Oliver muttered. You discovered what he had done before you passed away. He had never seen anything so awful as her smile. Well, I found out that one of his criminal accomplices sent him a letter that was intended for him, but ended up in his widow. In it, he talked of future plans and fortune that was waiting to be discovered. The elderly guy had become reckless, assuming that time had totally erased his traces. The portfolio held tight to Oliver's chest like a shield as he flattened himself against the wall. What did you do? Adelaide's voice carried the weight of decades as she said, I waited, I prepared, I waited, and I stoked my anger until it was powerful enough to withstand death itself. I knew he would come back eventually. The lure of hidden gold was too strong for greed like his. I continued to perform as a result. Assuring that no one else would disturb his hiding location was the distraught widow, the tragic character of local mythology. However, he never returned. No, he passed away in 1897 in Sydney. Yellow fever. His passing struck me like a blow to the body. I felt like I lost my opportunity at worldly justice. Her eyes glowed more intensely. However, I found that dying did not mean that possibilities were over. Death was just a shift in strategy. The study was illuminated in stark black and white as lightning split the sky outside. Oliver saw Adelaide plainly for what she had become in that flash of light. A force of nature fueled by sheer malevolence, not a ghost imprisoned by grief. Saltmere House had not been plagued by her. She had weaponized it, transforming the place where she had been betrayed into a stronghold of revenge. You brought me the proof, she added as she approached. Oliver found himself saying things he had not deliberately chosen, such as, you found the evidence I needed to make the world understand. Now everyone will know what Ezra Hargrave truly was. Now his name will be remembered, not as that of a tragic sea captain, but as the coward and criminal he really was. The treasure, is it not still there? Beneath the oak. Adelaide grinned dreadfully. Yes, exactly. All the stolen gold, each diamond saturated with blood. For all these years, I have diligently protected it. Not for him, though. Not for him. For fairness, I have protected it. What are you looking for from me? Assist me in totally destroying his legacy. Present the proof to the appropriate authorities. Allow them to uncover the garden and see what's underneath. Let the world witness the kind of man who, while making money from robbery and murder, leaves his wife to live in grief for the rest of her life. Supernatural energy seemed to vibrate through the place. The weight of Adelaide's accumulating animosity made the walls themselves tremble. Oliver understood that he was not just seeing a haunting. He was being enlisted in a vengeful army that had spent over a century training for combat. Oliver's scholarly mind was active despite the fact that terror was paralyzing his limbs. Adelaide's account contained details that did not quite fit together. Why had her haunting persisted for over a century if she had discovered the truth before her death in 1891 and Captain Hargrave had passed away in 1897? Why had she required Oliver to find evidence that she must have had all along? Adelaide's demeanor changed slightly, as though she could read his mind. For a brief moment, the awful smile wavered, giving way to what may have been doubt. During that short time, Oliver saw a hint of an alternative reality, one that clarified the true cause of Adelaide Hargrave's inability to sleep. Silently, "You never found the letter," he muttered. "You died believing in your husband's heroic end, but you never found out what he had done." Adelaide's shape wavered in the wind like a candle flame. She appeared, for a moment, less substantial, less sure of herself. Oliver went on, "You've been haunting this house for more than a century," his voice becoming more forceful as comprehension set in. "However, you weren't waiting for retribution or guarding wealth. You were looking. You searched for the truth, but you were never able to find it." The room's mystical vibe faltered. Adelaide's awful confidence was starting to waver. "No, I was aware. I was always aware. The sorrow was genuine. The grief was sincere. You died for him because you loved him, never being aware of his true actions." Oliver took a step closer, his hands still gripping the evidence portfolio. "My investigation revealed the truth to you. The answers you've been looking for over a century were finally provided by my discovery." Adelaide's body was turning hazy. As the base of her anger started to fracture, her connection to the physical world weakened. "I kept an eye out for him. I waited. You loved him, so you waited. Because you couldn't believe that he was really dead, even in death. The tears I heard weren't staged. They were genuine grief. It's only now that you realize there was nothing to lament after more than a century of grieving for him." The awful grin had vanished entirely, and in its stead was a look of such deep sadness that Oliver could feel the tears streaming down his face. The actual Adelaide Hargrave was like this, a lady whose love had been so powerful that it had endured death itself, only to be finally broken by the reality of treachery, rather than a monster of vengeance. Whispering, "He left me," she said, and her voice was now the sad cries of a heart realizing its own demise rather than the sound of wind through cemeteries. "Believing a lie, he allowed me to die." "Yes," Oliver answered softly. "Yes, he did. I apologize as well. I sincerely apologize." Adelaide gazed down at her hands, seeing them grow more translucent by the second. Only the searing wound of true loss remained as the anger that had kept her going for decades began to fade. "Now what should I do? Where should I go?" The remainder of her magical rage burst forth in one last, deadly pulse as she spoke. All of the windows that were still intact exploded at once, scattering glass pieces all around the room like a whirlwind. A portion of the north wall, it made a thunderous roar as it cracked down from floor to ceiling. The old telescope tipped over and broke against the fireplace. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the violence stopped, and in the sudden, deep silence, there were only floating mows of dust. Through the rubble, Oliver discovered that he was pulled to her by compassion rather than fear. "Now you're free. You found the truth you were looking for. The vigil has ended. You can relax. However, let the authorities handle the treasure. Declare his identity to the world. But that load is no longer yours to bear. It's been with you long enough." Adelaide, whose form was still fading, nodded slowly. Something that seemed almost like calm was replacing the gloomy mood that had pervaded Saul House for so long. "Will you ensure that they are aware of his actions? He shouldn't be regarded as a hero, in my opinion. I swear, the truth will come out," Oliver stated. "Everything." Then she smiled, and for the first time since Oliver had last seen her, the grin was not dreadful, but real. He saw a glimmer of the young woman Adelaide had been before betrayal, and sadness had changed her completely in that fading grin. She said, "Thank you," in a whisper, and the words conveyed the thankfulness of a soul that had been given permission to rest at last. quietness fell in the study. Like morning fog, the unearthly cold that had filled the home vanished. The storm clouds were lifting outside, exposing stars that appeared brighter than they should have been. Oliver was by himself in the study, surrounded by the records of a crime that had been committed a century before. He would call the police in the morning. He would lead them to the riches hidden beneath the oak tree and share his findings. At last, the real legacy of Captain Ezra Hargrave would be revealed. But for the time being, Oliver only stood in the tranquility of a home that had been at last liberated from the burden of accumulated grief. He believed that he heard footsteps ascending stairs for the final time in the distance, heading in the direction of whatever rest was in store for those who had put up with their troubles for far longer than any soul should. Finally, the distraught widow of Saltmere House was at peace. Oliver found a deeper form of justice in that tranquility than could possibly be obtained via retaliation alone. He picked up the papers that were lying around on the floor and placed them neatly on Captain Hargrave's desk. Police, archaeologists, journalists, and historians would all be present tomorrow. At last, Adelaide Hargrave's story would be told correctly, not as a supernatural thriller or gothic romance, but as the true tragedy it always was. Oliver approached the window and peered in. Up one last look at the widow's walk. Against the starry sky, it was vacant. After over a century of devoted dedication, its vigil was finally over. Something felt odd, though, even amid the restored silence. When Oliver touched the window frame, the glass was cold enough to sting his palm, and the air had a persistent coldness that was unrelated to the November night. He sensed it as he turned to collect the strewn-about papers. An unexplained, fleeting touch on his shoulder that wasn't totally consoling, but also wasn't menacing. A feeling of deep appreciation mixed with what could have been caution. Although the touch was brief, it left a chill that seemed to sink into his bones. The house fell into place around him, but it wasn't the sigh of satisfaction he had previously envisioned. This was the settling of a structure that had undergone significant alteration, characterized by forces that caused long-lasting damage. There would be damaged walls to fix and broken windows to explain in the morning. It would never feel quite the same in the study. Adelaide Hargrave had fallen asleep somewhere over the world border. However, Saltmere House will always remember her century-long vigil, serving as a constant reminder that some truths, once said, leave a lasting impression. Oliver's smile was timid, but it was still there. Adelaide had gotten the tranquility she was due thanks to him. However, he had also discovered that some doors could never be fully closed after they had been opened. In the end, the truth he had discovered was liberating, even though it was a terrible thing. And that could have been the most significant lesson Adelaide Hargrave imparted. What rides with us? Story number 2. As Nathaniel changed the frequency, the radio crackled with static, and he looked for anything to break the strange silence that had fallen upon their little group. The skeleton remains of abandoned farmhouses, which appeared to watch their passage with hollow, unblinking eyes, sometimes broke the waves of kudzu and pine that rolled past outside the windows of his father's vintage Buick. Sometimes you can pick up those late-night discussion shows. Try the AM band, Lawrence said from the passenger seat, his voice containing that certain brand of forced cheerfulness that had started to characterize their interaction since leaving Charleston 3 hours earlier. Behind him, Jeffrey shifted restlessly, his long legs folded uncomfortably in the claustrophobic back seat. Or we could simply enjoy the quiet, he said, although there was a hint in his tone that he didn't find the quiet pleasant. There's something to be said for contemplation during a journey. At 23, Nathaniel had the odd ability to appear both younger and older than his years, depending on the light and the attitude of the person taking the picture. His friends had always claimed that he was hard to photograph, but they could never quite explain why. Nathaniel saw his reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, a little gaunt, and with the kind of unremarkable features that seemed to vanish from memory moments after being observed. "Is that what we're calling this expedition now?" repeated Lawrence with a dry laugh. "I thought we were just trying to reach Atlanta before dawn." The truth was rather more complicated, as truth so often is. They had left Columbia with vague notions of adventure. 3 friends from university. adrift in that strange interregnum between graduation and whatever responsibilities awaited them in what people insisted on calling the real world. There had been talk of visiting Jeffrey's cousin, who was said to have found work in the film industry, though this cousin remained as vague as morning mist, mentioned frequently, but never quite substantiated with concrete details. Nathaniel suspected that none of them really cared whether they arrived in Atlanta at all. The suspension, this momentary release from the burden of becoming, was almost luxurious. The headlights carved a pale tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating a procession of road signs that seemed more and more surreal. Peach Orchard Road, Salvation Church, Harmony Mills, Historic District, each one seeming to promise something that it could not possibly deliver, as if the very act of naming these places had somehow leached them of their essential reality. Jeffrey was the first to spot her, standing at the edge of the light cast by a closed gas station, where the pumps had been removed, leaving behind rust stains on the concrete like old blood stains, and the building itself had taken on that strange desolateness that seems to gather around abandoned commercial enterprises. Even though she didn't wave or make any other action that may be interpreted as a request for help, her presence in that barren location at that hour seemed to be a mute plea. Should we stop? Her dark hair hung in lank curtains around a face that might have been pretty under different circumstances. Circumstances that did not involve standing alone on a deserted highway at 3 in the morning. And her unremarkable attire, dark jeans, a faded sweater, and canvas shoes that had seen better days, made Lawrence ask, even though he had already started to slow the car. She was probably 20 years old, though it was hard to tell in the hazy light. They pulled to a stop, and Lawrence rolled down his window. "She looks harmless enough," Jeffrey said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. But it's hardly the sort of night one would choose to be stranded outdoors. The night had grown cold, unseasonably so, for late September, and a thin mist had begun to gather in the hollows and creek beds, giving the landscape an ethereal, almost otherworldly quality. Nathaniel thought about how the lines separating the possible and the impossible might become temporarily permeable. He yelled, even though she had already started to approach the car using that same leisurely, almost ceremonial gait. She silently got into the back seat next to Jeffrey, adjusting herself with meticulous accuracy, as though she sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead through the windshield with an expression of profound, almost metaphysical sadness. Her silence was not the awkward quiet of shyness, nor the sullen withdrawal of hostility, but something far more complete, more absolute. "Where are you headed?" She turned to look at him, and Nathaniel caught a glimpse of her face in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and seemed to hold depths that were somehow inconsistent with the youthful planes of her face. When Jeffrey asked that, he turned to face her with the kind of determined sociability that people employ when they sense they are dealing with something that defies normal social conventions. Her eyes spoke of something ancient, experiences that could not possibly fit within the short period of time her appearance suggested. "Wherever you're going," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it doesn't matter." And indeed, from that moment on, it seemed that their destination had lost all significance, that the very idea of arrival had somehow been suspended, and the highway stretched ahead of them, endless and recursive, as if they had entered a realm where distance had become purely theoretical. The change was subtle at first, so gradual that Nathaniel was not entirely certain when he first became aware of it. It started with Lawrence, who had always been the most outgoing member of their group, going into an unusual silence. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he started looking at the rearview mirror repeatedly, not at the girl, but at Jeffrey, as if he had noticed something there that had not been there before. "You've been awfully quiet back there, Jeff," Lauren finally said, his tone deceiving no one with its forced casualness. "Everything okay?" Jeffrey laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. That rich, genuinely amused sound that had always been one of his most appealing traits, but something thinner, more brittle. "Just thinking," he said, "about things." "What sort of things?" pressed Lawrence, and there was something almost accusatory in the question. "Oh, the usual." Jeffrey's voice had taken on an oddly evasive quality. There was nothing explicitly menacing in Jeffrey's statement, nothing that could not be explained as simple philosophical musing, but the tone in which it was delivered seemed to turn it into something far more sinister. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Nathaniel felt his chest tighten, though he was unable to pinpoint the exact reason. Asked Lawrence, and now his voice had shed all pretense of casual conversation. "Nothing," said Jeffrey. "Everything. Is it important?" The girl had not moved or changed her stance in the least, and Nathaniel found himself examining her image in the mirror. However, she appeared to be more noticeable and controlling in some way, as though she were pulling all the talk, attention, and emotion into the event horizon of her unfathomable melancholy. "You know what I think? It's really quite pathetic when you think about it," Lawrence said abruptly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I think some people enjoy creating tension. I think some people get a perverse pleasure out of making others uncomfortable. And I think some people are so insecure about their own inadequacies that they project their paranoia onto others," Jeffrey said smoothly. Nathaniel opened his mouth to intervene, to say something that might restore the equilibrium that had somehow been lost, but he was unable to speak. It seemed as though the girl's silence had turned into contagious, spreading through the car like some sort of metaphysical infection. And he could only watch helplessly as his two oldest friends, people who had shared countless experiences, countless confidences, and countless moments of genuine affection, started to become strangers. The highway continued to unfold before them, but it no longer seemed to be leading anywhere. The same water tower, the same group of abandoned buildings, the same crossroads that led to places with names like Pleasant Valley and New Hope, names that had obviously been bestowed by people who had a touching faith in the ability of nomenclature to change reality. "Did you notice," Jeffrey said conversationally, "how quickly Lawrence offered to drive when we began this little adventure? Interesting, don't you think, Nathaniel? It was almost like he had a special urge to be in charge." Lawrence laughed harshly and strangely. "Or perhaps, Jeff, I simply didn't want to put anyone else through your driving. You almost put us in the ditch outside Balford. Do you remember? But you've conveniently forgotten about that, I guess." Jeffrey said, "I haven't forgotten anything." Nathaniel's skin crawled because of something in his voice. "Actually, I've been recalling a lot lately, patterns, stuff I'd previously missed." The girl moved in her chair a little. It was the first thing she had done since getting into the car, and Jeffrey and Lawrence both fell silent. Her very presence seemed to have the ability to break up their talk into several parts, like his acts or supernatural drama. In the ensuing quiet, Nathaniel heard noises he had never heard before. The sound of tires squealing on asphalt, the distant cries of a nighttime bird, and the nearly undetectable hum of the vehicle's electrical system. But there seemed to be more going on beneath these commonplace noises. A frequency that was slightly below the conscious perception threshold. It seemed to come from the girl herself, a sort of subsonic pulse. Nathaniel asked abruptly, his voice abnormally loud in the small room. "Where did you say you were from?" He was once again struck by the contrast between her youthful beauty and those old, melancholy eyes when she turned to face him. "I said nothing," she answered. "However, it makes no difference. No matter where you're from, I'm from there. Actually, the same location." There was something familiar about her features, though he was positive they had never met before. It was the kind of familiarity one sometimes experiences in dreams, a recognition that exists independent of actual knowledge or experience. "That's cryptic," said Lawrence, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "Are you always so mysterious? Or is this a special performance for our benefit?" The girl smiled then, but it was not a pleasant expression. It was an odd response that seemed to suggest intimacy while holding distance at the same time. "I find that people project their own mysteries onto others," she said. "They see what they need to see, what they're afraid to see." It was the kind of smile one might wear while watching something that was both tragic and humorous. The smile of someone who had seen the same story unfold countless times before and knew exactly how it would end. Philosophy from the Peanut Gallery. How refreshing. At least she's contributing to the conversation, Lawrence said. Unlike some people who seem content to make snide comments from the back seat. Jeffrey laughed, but it was the same brittle sound as before. Snide comments. Jeffrey's voice rose slightly. Is that what you call honesty these days? The accusation hung between them like a physical barrier, and Nathaniel found himself holding his breath, waiting for Jeffrey's response. But Jeffrey fell into a sullen silence, staring out the window at the passing landscape with an air of incredulity. I'm sorry if the truth makes you uncomfortable, but someone needs to point out that this little road trip was your idea, Lawrence. Your brilliant plan to escape reality for a few days. And look how well it's working out. My idea? Lawrence's voice was incredulous. You're the one who suggested we visit your mysterious cousin in Atlanta, your phantom relative in the film industry. Tell me, Jeff, does this cousin actually exist? Or is he just another one of your convenient fabrications? Nathaniel had the increasingly unsettling feeling that the girl was somehow masterminding the strife around her, that her very presence was serving as a trigger for feelings and accusations that had been simmering just beneath the surface of their friendship. The girl, on the other hand, continued to sit in perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of serene melancholy. I think Jeffrey has always resented our friendship, Nathaniel, Lawrence added abruptly, his voice becoming more candid. It seems to me that he has always felt like the odd man out. Additionally, I believe he has been searching for a chance to sour relations with me. Nathaniel objected. That's absurd. Yet even as he said it, he couldn't help but wonder whether Lawrence's statement included a kernel of truth. Had he opted to ignore any warning indications, tense or resentful moments? Press Lawrence, is this absurd? Consider it. When was the last time you accepted Jeffrey's invitation to do something without me? When was the last time he gave you a call for no other reason than to keep up a friendship? Jeffrey's face flushed with rage as he finally turned away from the window. He said, "You're crazy, completely suspicious. However, Lawrence, you have always been, haven't you? Constantly worried about who is speaking to who is joining, and who is not included. Really, it's pathological. Is it pathological?" On the steering wheel, Lawrence's knuckles were white. Jeffrey, let me explain what's pathological. The way you insert yourself into circumstances and play with people's emotions for your own entertainment is what's unhealthy. Do you really believe I haven't observed your attempts to turn Nathaniel against me? The subtle undermining, the small remarks. Both of his oldest friends seemed to be describing someone he had never met, and Nathaniel was torn between them. He knew a thoughtful, occasionally gloomy, but rarely manipulating Jeffrey. He was aware of a possessive but not paranoid Lawrence. However, as he heard their charges, he started to notice patterns of conduct he had seen but never recognized. Tiny tense moments, fleeting bitterness, and covert rivalries for allegiance and attention. The girl chose this time to speak once more, her voice piercing their dispute like a knife through silk. She noted that friendships are such delicate things. They need a great deal of upkeep and cautious consideration. The fact that any of them live at all is astounding. Jeffrey and Lawrence both became silent, as though her remarks had somehow diverted their fury onto her or at least lessened it. Nathaniel could sense Jeffrey's barely restrained wrath as he stared at her in the mirror. Jeffrey inquired, "And what would you know about friendship? You're not even familiar with us. We just met you on the side of the road as a random stranger." That same knowing, melancholy smile came back on the girl's face. Then she answered, "I know enough. You're all acting like someone you're not, and I know it. I am aware that traveling to Atlanta and seeing someone's cousin aren't the main goals of this trip. I'm aware that all of you are fleeing from something, but you are unaware of what it is." Her remarks seemed like an accusation, and Nathaniel couldn't help but wonder whether she was mistaken. From what did they flee? In the early hours of the morning, what did they hope to discover on the roads of Georgia and South Carolina? Outside, the scenery had become more and more strange. Its familiar shapes had become odd and otherworldly as the mist increased. Trees turned into hideous shapes, their branches extending like supplicating arms in the direction of the automobile. Road signs appeared in the fog and then disappeared again, as though they were only visible at that precise moment. Even though the gauge still indicated almost 3/4 of a tank and perhaps some food, Lawrence suggested that we stop for gas. Jeffrey noted that nothing is open at this hour. It's all closed. There may be an all-night diner or a truck stop. How long has it been since you last saw a car on this road? There was a weird, almost dreamy aspect to Jeffrey's voice. How long has it been since we last saw any indication of civilization? Nathaniel recognized it was true. They had been traveling for what seemed like hours without coming across another car, without going through a town or even a village. The roadway appeared to be completely isolated, as though it had been built just for them, as though the world outside their headlights had just vanished. Maybe we should turn around, he said. Return to Columbia. Tomorrow, start over. As though the thought of changing direction had never occurred to them, his two pals turned to face him with looks of deep surprise. Turn around, Lawrence said. But we've made great progress. To what extent? Jeffrey was asked. Are you even aware of our location? Lawrence took a quick look at the dashboard assortment of instruments, which ought to have given him some idea of where they were, how fast they were moving, and how far they had come. However, the display appeared strangely blurry, as though they were seen through thick glass or water. Never settling on a single figure, the speedometer needle fluctuated between readings. The odometer had turned into a rotating jumble of numbers. Nathaniel said abruptly, "The radio? Give the radio another go. Perhaps a local station will be available." Something about the weather or traffic reports. Lawrence's hand made contact with the tuning dial, but it just produced static. Something deeper, more natural, rather than the typical static of far-off stations or atmospheric interference. It sounded almost like breathing, or maybe like the hushed chatter of distant voices. For the first time since she had gotten into the automobile, the girl leaned forward a little. She said, "You won't discover anything. Not along this route. Not now. How are you aware?" Jeffrey asked in a suspiciously piercing voice. "What specific knowledge do you possess regarding this road?" She returned to her seat and assumed that position of complete stillness. She answered, "I know that it goes where it needs to go. I am aware that it transports people to their destinations." Her statements seemed to have a weight far out of proportion to their significance, despite being cryptic and nearly meaningless. Nathaniel found himself examining her image in the mirror once more, trying to find a hint as to who she was or what she was doing. Her face had a certain quality that kept bugging him. Even though he was positive they had never met, there was something about it that implied familiarity. "You're talking in riddles," Lawrence remarked. The girl laughed softly, almost melodiously, but there was no joy in it. "If you know anything about where we are, about where this road leads, then just say it plainly." She answered, "Some things can't be said plainly. There are some things that are only experienced." Jeffrey squirmed uneasily in his chair, seemingly having forgotten his previous animosity at Lawrence in the face of this fresh cause of annoyance. "What exactly do you experience? What do you believe we should go through?" "Just the truth," she said. "About you, about one another, and about the true meaning of friendship under pressure." Her words seemed to rekindle the earlier tension between Jeffrey and Lawrence, as if she had deliberately stoked a fire that had been temporarily banked. "The truth," Jeffrey repeated. "Oh well then. Lawrence, I have a truth for you. This was a vacation I never wanted to take. As you so wisely noted, my cousin doesn't exist, therefore I've never wanted to travel to Atlanta to see him. I made him up because I was sick of hearing you gripe about how dull your life had been and how much you wanted adventure. You lied to us," but Lawrence's hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly. Jeffrey answered, "I gave you what you wanted. A destination, a purpose, a cause to get out of town. Does the fact that the purpose was a lie really matter?" For the first time in a few minutes, Nathaniel spoke softly. "It matters to me. It is significant because, as Lawrence stated, it indicates that you have been deceiving us." When Jeffrey turned to look at him, Nathaniel noticed something in his face that he had never seen before. Previously, an intense rage that appeared far out of proportion to the situation. "Playing tricks on you." Jeffrey's voice lifted. "I've been working to rescue you two from the limited, routine lives you were leading. I've been attempting to provide you with an experience that is somewhat genuine." "Genuine?" Lawrence gave a stern laugh. "What is genuine about deceit and lies? What aspects of the lives you intended to lead are genuine?" Jeffrey fired back. Nathaniel planned to accept that position at his father's insurance business, where he would spend the remainder of his days handling claims and going to office parties. You were going to get married to Catherine, watch football, and gripe about your mortgage every weekend. Is that real? Is that a living thing? Nathaniel was rendered speechless by the charge, which hit home with surgical accuracy. Although he had been thinking about the job at his father's company and had started to see his future in more traditional terms, it sounded like a type of living death to hear it explained in Jeffrey's disdainful manner. Lawrence remarked, "At least we were being honest about our choices." Jeffrey laughed bitterly. "At least we weren't acting like someone we weren't." Honest? How recently have any of us been totally sincere about something that was important? The girl decided to interrupt again at this point, her voice piercing their dispute like a chilly wind. She claimed that honesty is overrated. The comfort of their delusions is what people truly desire, even though they claim to want the truth. The incongruity between her youthful appearance and the ageless melancholy in her eyes once again hit Nathaniel as the three of them turned to face her. Lawrence questioned, "What would you know about it?" The girl's smile was mysterious. "You haven't said anything honest since you got in this car." "Haven't I? I know exactly where this road leads. What if I told you that?" Jeffrey leaned forward, his previous animosity replaced by a sort of morbid fascination. "What are you talking about?" She said, "I'm talking about patterns. About the way certain stories repeat themselves over and over again, with different characters, but the same essential structure. I'm talking about the way people convince themselves that their experiences are unique, special, unprecedented, when in fact they're simply variations on ancient themes." Her words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, and Nathaniel wondered if she might not be describing their exact situation. Three friends, ostensibly close, learning that their relationships were based on shaky convenience and habit rather than, "I think we should let her out," said Lawrence abruptly. "I think we should stop the car and let her out right here." The highway continued to unfold before them, but it no longer appeared to be a typical road. The pavement had acquired an odd quality, as if it were not quite solid, as if it existed in some intermediate state between matter and energy. The reflective markers along the shoulder seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, and the yellow line down the center wavered like a stream of liquid light. Jeffrey looked over his shoulder. "It is 4 a.m. here in the middle of nothing. Take a look at her." Even though the girl was seated less than 3 feet away, Lawrence muttered as though he was worried she would overhear him. "Take a close look at her. Something is not right. Something that isn't natural." Nathaniel was once again examining the girl's reflection, and he believed that this time he had picked up on something that had previously slipped his notice. In some way, her reflection in the mirror didn't look as solid as it should have, as though she weren't completely real and present. In his peripheral vision, in reflected glimpses, she seemed to waver like heat shimmer on summer pavement. Yet when he blinked and looked at her directly, she looked sufficiently solid. Jeffrey responded, "You're imagining things," but his tone was unconvinced. "Am I? How recently did you witness her breathing? How long had she been blinking?" With increasing apprehension, Nathaniel acknowledged that it was true. The girl sat perfectly still, her dark eyes unblinking and her chest neither rising nor dropping. But she kept talking, she kept smiling, that knowing, sorrowful smile. And she kept using her enigmatic power to change the mood of the car. As though listening to their whispered talk, the girl said, "Breathing is such a human preoccupation, such a constrained approach to life." Nathaniel felt a chill from her remarks that had nothing to do with the car's temperature. Her tone gave the impression that she was speaking from a place outside the realm of ordinary human experience, as though she were looking at them from a higher vantage point that made their worries and anxieties completely unimportant. "Stop the car," Jeffrey abruptly commanded. His voice was tense with fear. Nathaniel could see that Lawrence was losing whole control of the car, even as he said, "Stop the car right now." His hands held the steering wheel, but the car appeared to be moving in its own direction, propelled by a force beyond human volition or mechanical operation. With the needle violently whirling between readings and through the glass, the speedometer had entirely failed. It appeared as though the road ahead was curved in ways that went against the standard rules of geometry. "I can't," said Lawrence in a whisper. "I'm unable to stop it." The automobile was filled with the girl's sweet, melodic, and completely cold laughing. "You could never," she said. "You all could never. The point is that." Jeffrey reached for the door handle, but it was nowhere to be found. Or it might not have existed at all. The car's interior had become surreal, as though the familiar surfaces and items were changing on their own volition in accordance with a logic that was outside the realm of ordinary perception. Nathaniel heard himself ask, "What do you want from us?" But his voice sounded distant, as though it were coming from someone else. The girl turned to face him, and there appeared to be depths in her eyes that went well beyond the boundaries of the car, the highway, and everything that could be deemed normal, genuine, or even imaginable. She said, "I want you to understand. When friendship is stripped of all pretense, convenience, and cozy lies that make it acceptable, I want you to realize what it truly is." While they conversed, the tensions between Jeffrey and Lawrence appeared to solidify into something more robust and long-lasting. Their arguments about the trip, Jeffrey's imaginary cousin, and Lawrence's purported paranoia had evolved into something more. Deeper grievances, long-standing resentments, and basic incompatibilities that had been covered up by years of mutual convenience and shared experiences were being unearthed. Lawrence told Jeffrey, "You've always thought you were better than us," in a stern and exacting tone. "You're smarter, more sophisticated, and more deserving of whatever success looks like in your world." Jeffrey answered, "And you've always been happy to be mediocre." Their words seemed to be causing physical wounds, and Nathaniel found himself caught between them, unable to mediate, unable to restore the equilibrium that had once existed between the three of them, because they were willing to accept the first acceptable option that came up, whether it was a job, a relationship, or a way of seeing the world. He understood, feeling more and more horrified that the girl had been correct. Their friendship had been based on sand rather than true affection or understanding, and had been kept together by habit and convenience. The vehicle persisted in its stumbling through the night, deviating from the highway and forging its own route through scenes that appeared to exist outside of time and space. Nathaniel saw glimpses of unattainable landscapes through the windows, towns that gleamed with lights arranged in patterns that were painful to look at directly, and forests that stretched to far-off mountain ranges that had never been depicted on any map. Bodies of water that mirrored a different sky instead of the sky above. Jeffrey told the girl, "This is your doing," in a terrified and accusing tone. "This is something you're causing and bringing about." The girl's smile expanded, displaying teeth that were excessively white, flawless, and numerous. Her words, "I'm not making anything happen, I'm just giving you a glimpse of what was always there. For years, you have been rejecting the basic incompatibility, the animosity, and the resentment." Nathaniel objected. "That's not true." However, he could sense the conviction evaporating from his words, even as he spoke. Was it accurate? Had their friendship always been a sort of shared lie, a convenience plot that had passed for true love? Is it not? The girl inquired. "How recently have any of you given up something significant for the others? How recently have you put friendship ahead of self-interest?" Nathaniel discovered that he was unable to respond to her questions, which lingered in the air like accusations. To be honest, no. Over the years, there had been innumerable instances of betrayal, times when he had opted for the simpler, more realistic, or less emotionally or practically taxing way. There was a sulky quiet between Jeffrey and Lawrence. But like fire from a furnace, Nathaniel could sense the animosity emanating from both of them. They were now rivals confined to the same area rather than companions embarking on an adventure. Their mutual distaste was at last unencumbered by social norms. Despite Lawrence's foot not being on the gas pedal, the automobile started to speed. The sound of the engine shifted, taking in an elevated note that appeared to blend with an unintelligible frequency that came from the girl. It was painful to stare at the incomprehensible scene outside the windows as it dissolved into streams of light and shadow. Nathaniel inquired, "Where are we going?" But he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer anymore. "Where we've always been going," the girl asked. Nathaniel's chest constricted with fear as she said, "To the place where all such journeys end." Her words held a weight of inevitable consequence. He was beginning to feel as though they were nearing a turning point, a final epiphany that would dispel any illusions they still held. A tiny object attracted the low light from the dashboard as Jeffrey struggled with it in his jacket pocket. He said, "I have a knife," in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. You could what?" the girl questioned, turning to him with that same sulky, sardonic look. "A pocket knife? What specific actions do you believe a knife could take to make a difference?" However, Jeffrey had beyond reason. One desperate impulse had formed from the accumulation of tension, dread, and hate. With the little blade Glenn in his hand, he lunged toward Lawrence at the front seat. When Lawrence noticed him approaching, he violently wrenched the steering wheel to the left in an attempt to knock Jeffrey off balance. But the abrupt movement put the vehicle into an uncontrollable skid. They were speeding through space with no discernible connection to gravity or direction, and the highway, or whatever it was they had been riding on, seemed to vanish beneath them. Nathaniel experienced the effect as an overwhelming surge of sensation that each and every nerve in his body. He had an epiphany during which he was able to see everything with unnatural accuracy. Jeffrey's face contorted in anger and terror. Lawrence's grip on the steering wheel froze. The girl sat perfectly composed while the world around her erupted in mayhem. Then there was darkness. He couldn't recall how he got there, but he was standing on the side of a highway. It was so quiet, so absolute, as though all sound had been removed from the planet. No insects, no breeze, and no cars in the distance. Only the kind of pristine silence found only in the vacuum of space or the darkest caverns. The night was clear, the visible stars in odd arrangements that appeared to have been altered by some cosmic joker with a strange sense of humor. The moon was low on the horizon, illuminating everything with a faint light that appeared to sap its color. In a way that was both frightening and strangely freeing, he felt lost and disengaged from his body. He discovered only pieces of what had transpired when he tried to recall it. The sound of irate voices, the feeling of uncontrollable movement, the impact that had appeared to shatter reality itself. However, the specifics remained obstinately elusive, like to the shards of a dream that vanish when one awakens. He could see out headlights coming from a distance, mechanically piercing the darkness. He knew the car as they approached. It was his father's old Buick, the same vehicle that had driven them out of Colombia with such hopeful intentions. IT came to a stop next to him, and a familiar face appeared through the rolled-down passenger window. "Mun." Lawrence's voice had that special brand of cheery worry that had always been one of his most charming traits as he said, "Rough night. Do you need a ride?" Jeffrey smiled and leaned forward behind him. "Nathaniel, you appear to have seen a ghost. Is everything okay?" They appear to be just as they had been when they started off. Calm, amiable, and unaffected by the conflicts and charges that had ripped them apart in those last awful moments in the automobile. The animosity and terror that had marked their previous encounters had vanished. There was no sign that they had any memory of what had happened. Nathaniel started to ask them questions about the girl, the collision, and the weird places they had been through, but he was unable to form the words. In whatever world they had momentarily occupied, it seemed as though a crucial component of his voice had been lost. Rather, he merely nodded and slipped into the rear seat, feeling a mixture of lingering worry and deep relief as he settled into the comfortable upholstery. The car's inside was just as he had recalled it from the start of their trip. There was still a hint of his father's cologne on the fabric. The assortment of road maps and trip guides strewn all over the dashboard. As it looked for a clear signal, the radio crackled with static. Jeffrey turned and gave him a sincere smile. "We were just talking about stopping for coffee," he replied. After adjusting the rearview mirror, Lawrence briefly looked at Nathaniel's in the reflection. "There's supposed to be an all-night diner about 20 m ahead, the sort of place that serves breakfast at any hour and doesn't ask too many questions about why you're traveling at 4 o'clock in the morning. Are you sure you're all right? You appear somewhat pallid." Nathaniel opened his mouth to describe what had happened to him, but the words seemed to vanish before they could get out. What could he say about the trip they had just finished? How could he account for the girl's existence, the slow breakdown of their bond, and the impossibly difficult terrain they had traversed? The memory of a particularly vivid nightmare that loses its ability to frighten in the glaring light of awake consciousness made everything appear suddenly distant. He heard himself say, "I'm fine," even though he thought his voice sounded weird. It was hollow, as though it were coming from far away. It was the deep, truly amused tone Nathaniel had always loved. "You'll feel like a different man after we give you some coffee at this diner. There's nothing that fried cuisine and a strong cup of coffee can't fix." The car was filled with the kind of vapid pop music that is the background music for innumerable midnight drives when the radio finally locked onto a station. Jeffrey went back to studying the road atlas, attempting to map out their path to Atlanta with the meticulous accuracy that had always defined his planning style, while Lawrence started tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time with the beat. Nathaniel started to question whether he had somehow dreamed the entire incident, because everything was so typical, so absolutely ordinary. He might have dozed off. "While driving, I had a really vivid dream of some sort. Perhaps a string of anxiety-driven hallucinations was a manifestation of the stress of approaching graduation and making decisions about his future." Even as he attempted to make sense of what had happened to him, however, he couldn't help but notice the roadside and the shadows that formed in the gaps between the trees. And he saw her, the same girl with the same dark hair and sad eyes, standing at the edge of the light from a closed gas station, watching their passage with an expression of deep, almost spiritual despair. There was nothing about the temperature in the automobile that chilled him when he saw her. She was young and unassuming in her attire, but she had that strange stillness that had given her such a haunting presence, and she was just as he remembered her. Although she didn't make any motion that could be interpreted as a cry for help, she stood at the edge of the road as though she was waiting for something. Lawrence questioned, "Should we stop?" As they got closer to her location, they slowed the car. Jeffrey craned his neck to get a better view at her and remarked, "She looks harmless enough. Furthermore, it's not exactly the kind of night one would like to be left outside." Nathaniel started to object, to tell them what would happen if they let her into the car, but his voice completely stopped talking. The female started to approach them with that same leisurely, almost ceremonial gait, and he could only watch in growing terror as they came to a stop and Lawrence rolled down his window. Lawrence yelled out, "Need a lift?" And the girl reached for the door handle while nodding silently. But before she could get into the seat next to Nathaniel, she stopped and stared at him through the window. He noticed a recognition in her eyes when they met his that chilled him to the core. She had an unfathomable sense of who he was, what he had become, and what part he was meant to play in the awful drama that was about to take place. Her words, "Wherever you're going," reverberated vividly through the glass. As she was inside the car, getting into the seat with that meticulous perfection he remembered so well. Doesn't matter. As she looked straight ahead through the glass, her hands were folded in her lap. Something deeper and more oppressive, a kind of silence that seems to push against the eardrums and make normal breathing difficult, replaced the awkward quiet that followed her entrance. In the faint light from the dashboard, Nathaniel found himself examining the features of his friends, waiting for the first indications of the transformation he knew was imminent. Lawrence was the first, whose over time, a more reserved expression replaced the happy one. Imperceptibly, his hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he started looking at Jeffrey more frequently than a friendly concern, with a frequency that implied rising distrust. Jeffrey, on the other hand, had reportedly forgotten his earlier excitement about the meal and their trip to Atlanta, and had fallen into an unusual stillness. He sat looking at the passing scenery through the passenger window. The image of him in the glass became more and more menacing. Since getting into the automobile, the girl had remained still and had not moved at all. However, her presence appeared to be affecting the environment with the same gravitational pull Nathaniel had previously recalled. She seemed to be bringing all of his friends' hidden conflicts, unsaid grievances, and basic incompatibilities into the open and making them face realities they had been avoiding for years. Eventually, With that same attempted casualness in his voice, Lawrence added, "You've been awfully quiet back there, Jeff." That was where their previous trip into strife had started. "Is everything okay?" Jeffrey's laugh was thin and brittle as he pondered whether or not some people are truly the friends they claim to be. The statements were the same as he had said before, and Nathaniel became increasingly horrified to see that he was seeing not just a similar series of events, but the exact same series. As though they were all actors in a cosmic play, destined to repeatedly perform the same sad scenarios. Every word, gesture, and slow buildup of hatred was being repeated with mechanical precision. He attempted to speak, to alert them to the impending danger, to somehow interrupt the cycle, but his voice refused to follow his instructions. He was stuck in the observer's role, powerless to stop his friend's unstoppable progress toward their demise. The same charges and countercharges that had ripped apart the accusations started up again that shattered their friendship in that first dreadful voyage. Lawrence's charges of lying and manipulation, Jeffrey's admission that his cousin in Atlanta was a fake character, and the slow realization that their friendship had been founded on far shakier roots than either of them had anticipated. The girl sat perfectly still throughout it all. Her presence acted as a trigger for feelings and revelations that could have otherwise stayed hidden beneath their cozy relationship's exterior. With that same sad, knowing smile that suggested she had seen this specific tragedy countless times before, she watched their collapse as both an audience and a participant, witness and instigator. The roadway started to have the same weird feel to it that Nathaniel had recalled from their last trip. The pavement appears to be in a state halfway between matter and energy. The swaying yellow center lined the reflective marks pulsed with their own internal rhythm, resembling liquid light. Beyond the windows, the landscape changed in accordance with logics beyond the realm of ordinary experience, unveiling views that were incompatible with any traditional conception of geography or physics. How recently have any of you been totally truthful about anything that was important? As he spoke, Jeffy's voice rose with the same frantic rage that had marked his earlier delivery of these lyrics. Lawrence's reply was delivered with the same icy accuracy and right on time. We were at least being truthful about our decisions. We weren't acting like someone we weren't, at least. Having committed the entire interaction to memory during their initial journey through this nightmare, Nathaniel found himself mouthing the phrases along with them. Each charge, each defensive reaction, with the inevitability of a natural law, every slow buildup toward violence was playing out precisely as it had previously. The girl's interjections were given in the same tone of sorrowful wisdom and at exactly the same times. Friendships are quite delicate. They need a great deal of upkeep and cautious consideration. The fact that any of them live at all is astounding. Later on, some things become difficult to express clearly. There are some things that are only experienced. Lastly, I want you to comprehend. When friendship is stripped of all pretense, convenience, and cozy lies that make it acceptable, I want you to realize what it truly is. When a vehicle started to accelerate past, Nathaniel became aware of Lawrence's power as Jeffrey struggled to find the knife in his jacket pocket as the inevitable crisis drew near, realizing that he was not only a spectator but a key player in these events. In some way, the catastrophe could not have happened without him in the car. Whatever mechanism was causing this unending recurrence, his quiet testimony was the last part. Jeffrey swung the knife in Lawrence's direction. The automobile entered its deadly skid when Lawrence violently wrenched the steering wheel to the left. However, this time, just before impact, Nathaniel noticed something that had slipped his mind on their initial run through the sequence. He saw in the girl's eyes, which were reflected in the rearview mirror, not only sadness, but also a sort of desperate longing. It was the expression of someone who was just as stuck in this cycle as he was, destined to act as a catalyst and witness for reasons she could not comprehend or control. As previously, there was an explosion of pleasure that overpowered every nerve, followed by a flash of flawless clarity that allowed him to see everything with unnatural accuracy. Then everything darkened once more. He found himself standing on a highway side at the exact same location as previously, with the same utter silence surrounding him and the same incorrectly arranged stars overhead. His teeth ached from the intensity of the déjà vu feeling, as though his entire neurological system was rejecting the impossibility of what he was going through. However, he realized what was happening to him this time. He was aware of his transformation this time. He could make out the headlights coming from a distance, mechanically piercing the darkness. He and his 3 pals were traveling toward Atlanta in his father's old Buick in search of their missing relative. As usual, they would stop along the route, heading toward the discovery of the underlying fragility that underlies their connection. With the same upbeat concern, Lawrence would roll down his window and offer him a ride. The pattern would restart when Jeffrey would lean forward and make the same comment about his spectral look before climbing into the rear seat and resting onto the comfortable upholstery. He was now the unintentional cause of their demise, the hitchhiker, the trigger. His presence in the vehicle would in some way give the girl more power, provide the ideal environment for their friendship to gradually deteriorate and ultimately lead to their unavoidable collision. And one of them would end up standing on the side of the road, exactly like Nathaniel was now, sentenced to repeat the cycle with the next group of tourists who happened to pass this way after it was all finished, after the automobile had skidded off whatever impossibly long highway they had been on. The vehicle came to a halt next to him, and the passenger window slid down to show Lawrence's well-known face, undisturbed by any recollection of their past interactions or knowledge of what was going to happen. His voice carried that special kind of cheery worry that had always been one of his most charming traits. "Would dude, rough night," he murmured. "Need a ride?" Nathaniel glanced over his shoulder at Jeffrey, who was smiling expectantly as always, and knew he had to make a decision. He had 2 options. He could decline the ride, leave into the night, and maybe end the cycle in some way, or he could get into the car and let the scene play out as it always had, knowing that his involvement would eventually result in their demise. As he contemplated the prospect of rejection, however, he found himself approaching the automobile with the same leisurely, almost ceremonial attitude that he had seen in the girl. Without conscious volition, his hand groped for the door handle, as though he were being led by powers without his knowledge or control. He took a seat at the back, and as he did, he noticed her. With that face of deep, almost metaphysical anguish, the original hitchhiker, who was standing on the other side of the road, saw him take his position in the sequence. Across the darkness, their eyes locked, and he saw his own confined state reflected in hers. The understanding that they were both bound by the same unending cycle of repetition. She held up her hand in what may have been a wave or a goodbye, and then the car was on its way once more, taking him and his gullible companions to their rendezvous with revelation and devastation. Behind them, standing by the side of the road, she waited for the next batch of people to pass by, so she could start her own dreadful journey anew. As Jeffrey looked for a clear signal, the radio came to life, flooding the car with static. Lawrence didn't ask many questions about why people were traveling at 4 in the morning, instead focusing on the diner 20 miles ahead that provided breakfast at any time. Nathaniel felt the weight of his new knowledge pressing down on his consciousness like a physical load as he settled back into the comfortable couch. Now he was both victim and offender, stuck in a seemingly endless loop with no end in sight. The same conflicts, the same charges, the same slow disclosure of basic incompatibility that would destroy his companions would be triggered by his presence. And one of them would be the next hitchhiker, the next unintentional tool of destruction. When it was all over, when the car had finished its voyage into whatever realm existed outside the usual bounds of space and time. In the corner of his eye, something moved. Not nearly prophecy, not quite memory. The weight of the impending sunk like winter chill into his bones. Nathaniel wondered how many times this sequence had been repeated, how many groups of young people had passed this way, and how many friendships had been put to the test and found wanting on this specific stretch of highway as they drove deeper into the night, and the first faint indications of tension started to show in his friend's behavior. Like an endless series of mirrors, the possibilities loomed before him. Every reflection depicts the same tragic tale, albeit with different characters and the same outcome. He remembered what the girl had said. "You're all acting like someone you're not, and I know it. I am aware that traveling to Atlanta and seeing someone's cousin aren't the main goals of this trip. I am aware that all of you are fleeing from something, but you are unaware of what it is." He realized now what they had been fleeing, what everyone on this path was running from. The reality about themselves, their relationships, and the cozy lies that allowed them to live a regular existence. The facades people built to shield themselves from harsh realities were methodically torn away on this route, where such facts could no longer be evaded. However, there was a cost to the discovery. Experiencing the same letdown repeatedly without the chance to grow from it or move past, it is the cost of repetition, of being stuck in the moment of discovery eternally. Nathaniel closed his eyes as the same pattern of accusation and defensiveness started to take hold. As Lauren started to make those first subtle remarks about Jeffrey's quiet, and as Jeffrey answered with the same brittle laugh, that I attempted to envision what it would be like to just deny his role as an observer and catalyst, to simply go outside the sequence. But such a refusal was impossible, and he knew it with the clarity that comes from first-hand experience. He was as enslaved to his role as his companions would be, and as much a prisoner of the pattern as the girl who had come before him. He had been taken by the highway and integrated into its everlasting system. Furthermore, the cycle of disclosure and recurrence that lay before him like an endless chain of grief was unbreakable. Nathaniel sat back in his seat to watch the same old tragedy play out again, knowing that he would do so for as long as the road lasted. The car kept driving through the darkness, taking its passengers toward their unavoidable destination. As long as people kept going down its entire length to find something they couldn't quite identify or comprehend, he believed he could hear the echo of all the other trips in the stillness that's surrounding them, broken only by the sound of tires on asphalt and the distant cries of some nighttime bird, all of the earlier charges, disclosures, and turning points. Like the pages of an unclosable book, they appear to exist concurrently, stacked one on top of the other. A tale that was never able to come to its right ending. On the highway that led to nowhere, that led everywhere, that led inexorably back to itself in an endless circle of repetition, revelation, and sorrow that had no beginning and would have no end, the girl stood at the side of the road somewhere behind them, getting smaller by the mile, waiting for the next group of travelers to find her there and start the sequence over with new participants who had no idea what lay ahead. The sound of pages turning upstairs is the subject of Story 3. Chapter 1. The Coming Back. For 15 years, the boxes had been sitting in the storage unit, gathering dust and the strange mustiness that clings to items that have been forgotten. Victoria Ashworth had put off this realization for so long that she had nearly persuaded herself that the storage costs were just another regular expense, similar to the water or electricity bill, for keeping her early years securely enclosed in steel and concrete. However, now that she was in her small Portland, Oregon apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes that seemed to exude memories, she couldn't help but be drawn to one box for some reason. Her fingertips followed her mother's meticulous handwriting on the worn label. Vicky handled her books carefully. There was that special autumnal aspect to the late afternoon light coming in through her windows. As though the sun itself realized that summer's hopes had been dashed. It was golden, but also sad. She was victorious at the box on her kitchen table, where she had sat through innumerable silent dinners since the divorce, and with somewhat shaking hands, removed the lid. The smell she knew rose to greet her, with that unique combination of binding glue, old paper, and something else. Something retained in the pages that could have been her own breath as a youngster. Her most cherished friends from the ages of 8 to 14 were there. All 7 of the Penumbra Chronicles volumes, with the silver lettering that had once seemed so incredibly lovely still visible on their purple spines. Feeling its weight in her hands, she raised the first volume, The Shadow Garden. The number of times she had read these books? How many times had she slept with them on her chest? Thinking of the courageous twins, Cordelia and Lysander, who had entered the enigmatic space between light and shadow to protect their world from the approaching darkness. The covers identified the author as Evangeline Whitmore, although Victoria had never discovered any other details about her. No biographical information, no author photo, and no additional published works. A brief paragraph mentioning the Whitmore Literary Estate, Salem, Massachusetts, on the copyright page was the only indication of her existence. A detail Victoria had never considered pursuing, but had always found fascinatingly mysterious. Evangeline Whitmore disappeared into the very penumbra she had created, as though her existence had been limited to writing these 7 works. Victoria opened the first page and sat down on a reading chair, a battered leather object that was one of the few items she had claimed in the divorce settlement. She was welcomed by the well-known phrases like an old friend. There are gaps between gaps, my dear reader, where the shadows deepen and the light becomes dimmer. The most significant tales are told in these settings, because we only start to fully comprehend what we are looking at when we are unable to see well. The prose were more complex than she recalled, having layers of significance that her younger self had not been able to perceive. Throughout the afternoon and evening, she read, stopping sometimes to wonder at the author's ability to incorporate such intricate concepts into what she had previously thought of as straightforward adventure stories. When she arrived at the last book, The Twilight Threshold, it was almost midnight. The scene where Cordelia and Lysander eventually faced the Shadow King and discovered the true purpose of their mission had always been her favorite. She recalled staying up past her bedtime to complete it, the joy of turning the last page, and how all the loose ends had come together in an unexpected yet inevitable way. But something didn't feel right as she read. The narrative was the same, yet in some ways distinct, with shocking clarity. Details that she was positive she would have remembered appeared to jump off the page. For example, the description of Cordelia's bedroom was so accurate that Victoria's skin pricked with familiarity. With its solitary east-facing window and pastel yellow walls, the room was cozy despite its small size. The quilt that covered the bed, which was leaning against the distant wall, was clearly washed a lot. White background with blue flowers. Though it faded, the design was still discernible. A little bookshelf with well-read books on it, painted white but with chips at the corners, stood to the left of the bed. A little brass lamp with a green glass shade perched on a wooden desk beneath the window, its surface worn from years of use. Victoria's throat tightened with breath. This room was familiar to her, since it was her room, or rather, it had been her childhood room in the Salem, Massachusetts home where she had lived until she was 16. She knew it very well. Each and every detail, everything precise, right down to the chip she had unintentionally hit with her tennis racket in the bookshelf's corner. The room's contents would have appeared most familiar to someone who knew how to look, but she continued to read, her hands becoming steadier as her mind became less so. The diary, which was concealed under the mattress, was full with the aspirations and anxieties of a young girl who was only beginning to comprehend the complexity of the world. The assortment of polished stones collected from shore. They had all been picked for reasons that had been forgotten but seemed significant at the time. The dresser's tiny music box, with its ballerina stopped in mid-stride pirouette, awaiting the key to be wound so she can begin dancing once more. The music box. Victoria's lips dried up. She had kept the music box a secret from everyone, including her mother. It had been her hidden gem, bought with her allowance money after being found at a thrift store. Winding the key and watching the little ballerina spin as the Elise's sparkling notes filled the air, she had concealed it in her chamber and only brought it out when she was with herself. How did the book include this? How was her private life known to Evangeline Whitmore? Victoria's vision had started to become a little blurry, but she kept reading. She couldn't tell if it was from fatigue or something else. Writing in the journal that had been her regular companion, Cordelia sat at her desk, as though her hand were being guided by another awareness. The words seemed to have a life of their own and flowed from her pen. The weird dreams that had been haunting her were described in her writing. Dreams of a girl who appeared to be living in a world that was somewhat different from her own, but nevertheless extremely similar. A girl who read stories about courageous kids who explored magical worlds all day long, without realizing that she was the focus of someone else's story. Victoria couldn't understand why the book was becoming heavier in her hands. She had read the same paperback book innumerable times, but suddenly it appeared to have an almost intolerable weight. She made herself keep going. The girl in Cordelia's dreams resided in a little apartment with yellow walls and a kitchen table that had seen better days in a location named Portland. She read novels that recalled her of better days in the evenings, ate meals in silence, and worked at a job that gave her little satisfaction. This dream girl was lonely, more alone than she wished to acknowledge. Cordelia occasionally pondered whether the loneliness was so intense that it had somehow transcended the limits of other universes. Victoria knocked over her glass of water as she stood up, slamming the book shut. The liquid soaked into the cardboard box containing the remaining volumes as it spread across the table. She struggled to comprehend what she had just read as she watched the water discolor the cardboard. This was not feasible. Decades before she had arrived to Portland, before her divorce, before the apartment with its yellow walls and scratched kitchen table, the book had been written. Nevertheless, every element of the explanation was flawless. Her fingers trembling, she opened the book once more and flipped to the page she had just read. Now, as though the ink itself were alive, the words appeared to writhe on the paper, albeit they were still there. She continued reading. However, Cordelia was well aware that dreams were not always what they appeared to be. They were windows at times, doors at other times, and invitations at very infrequent times. Victoria found it odd that the page ended in the middle of a chapter. She found something that chilled her to the bone as she turned the following page. Chapter 23, The Letter, was the chapter heading, and she couldn't recall ever having a chapter 23. Chapter 22 had always marked the end of the twilight threshold. She knew for sure. Another chapter, however, appeared as though it had always been there, printed in the same typeface on the same kind of paper. Victoria started reading. If you are reading this, my lovely Victoria, it is time for us to have a face-to-face conversation. I can appreciate your perplexity and know that this must seem impossible to you. How can a book's characters speak to the reader? How is it possible for the fictional to connect with the real? However, you have to realize that the lines separating truth from fiction are not as clear-cut as you may think. Victoria, we each have our own location and our own manner of being. We are conscious. We feel things. We are afraid. And we're terrified right now. The Shadow King has managed to enter your realm from ours. He has been observing, analyzing, and picking up knowledge from you. You are building a bridge between our worlds each time you read our stories and immerse yourself in our journeys. He intends to use that bridge today. Victoria, we need your assistance. We need you to return to us and join into our lives as we VE stepped into yours. There is no other way to stop him. The only way to prevent the darkness that wants to devour both of our universes. Examine the area beneath your bed. There, you'll find what you need. The music box was always intended for you, Pia, Cordelia, and Leander, with love and fervent hope. We ensured that you would locate it. Victoria could hardly hold the book anymore due to her hands' extreme shaking. It was impossible to write the letter. The book was printed in the same typeface as the rest of the book, but there it was. Another chapter title appeared as she flipped the page. The invitation in chapter 24. Unlike the previous chapters, this one was unique. It looked to be handwritten in a wobbly, unsure script rather than typeset. The ink appeared to shine a little in the lamplight and was dark blue, nearly black. I'm certain that you have read Cordelia's letter, Victoria. I understand that you are scared and perplexed, but you have to pay attention to me right now because time is running out. With every second that goes by, the Shadow King gets stronger. He thrives on uncertainty, dread, and the gaps between the imagined and the real. He has been taking advantage of your solitude, loneliness, and intense need for human connection. Every meal you eat in silence, every night you spend by yourself, and every time you wish your life were different. He gets stronger as a result. However, it also strengthens the link between our worlds. Victoria, you are more than just our reader. In your world, you are our fulcrum. The stories you adore, the people you care about, and the worlds you escaped are all made possible by your imagination and willingness to believe, just as we are your anchor in ours. That power is what the Shadow King seeks to eliminate. He's trying to tell you that stories aren't important. That's a useless imagination. That the dull, meaningless life you've been leading is all that exists. He wishes to ensnare you in a world devoid of wonder, optimism, and the potential for magic. We won't let him to, though. He cannot be allowed. He will be able to cross over entirely if he is successful in severing your ties to our realm. Your environment will become as gloomy and desolate as he is, and he will bring the shadow with him. Victoria, you have to come to us. You need to deal with the situation as soon as possible. Examine the area beneath your bed. The pen is waiting for you there. Write your way into our universe by taking it. Include yourself in our narrative. However, act quickly, since dawn will bring the Shadow King's last attack. It will be too late for us all if you don't get to us before the light comes up. Evangeline Whitmore, your companion in the penumbra. Victoria sat in her chair, staring at nothing, and closed the book. Except for the distant sound of traffic on the street below and the hum of the refrigerator, the flat was quiet. In light of what she had just read, the normalcy of these sounds felt almost obscene. It couldn't happen, she assured herself. Books didn't change on their own. Readers were not in contact with the characters. If Evangeline Whitmore was dead, then authors who had been dead for decades did not compose private letters to strangers. However, she found herself rising up from her chair despite telling herself these things. She found herself heading toward her bedroom, despite her insistence that this was all some complex delusion caused by stress and fatigue. Despite her assurances that the only things beneath her bed would be dust and possibly a few socks she had forgotten, she ended up crouching on the hardwood floor and raising the edge of her quilt. There was the pen. The fountain pen was ancient. The type that needed silver-bodied ink cartridges that had been smoothed by innumerable hands. It felt like it had just been used because it was warm to the touch. Victoria could also feel a slight pulse-like vibration passing through the metal when she picked it up. Holding the pen, she perched on the side of the bed and tried to think clearly. There must have been a reason. This pen must have belonged to her at one time, and she forgot about it. The warmth she felt must have been a figment of her imagination during what was obviously some sort of psychological episode, and it must have rolled under the bed years ago. But even while she was thinking these things, she kept going back to the book that was open on her table in the kitchen. At the back of the volume, she discovered that she was turning to a blank page that had not been there previously, but was now unquestionably there. She uncapped the pen and touched the tip to the paper. The ink was deep, dark, and somehow alive, flowing like a liquid shadow. Victoria started writing without thinking. I'm not sure whether this is real or not. I'm going crazy. I have no idea whether you're able to read this, whether you are real, or whether any of this is taking place. However, I am aware that my current manner of life is not sustainable. I am aware that I cannot continue to act as though this dreary, meaningless life is sufficient. I recall what it was like to think that magic existed, to think that there were other planets, important stories, and caring persons out there. I recall the sensation of being a part of something greater than myself, something amazing and awful and completely real. I'm prepared if you need my assistance and you're out there. I'm sick of being by myself. I'm weary of fear. I'm sick of a world devoid of wonder. Give me instructions. The words glistened on the page as soon as she was done writing. It appeared as though the ink was moving, rearranging itself into new words and patterns. Enter your bedroom and face the mirror. You will be in the shadow garden once you pass through. There, we'll be waiting for you. But keep in mind that there is no turning back once you pass over. Your previous life will come to an end, and a new one will start. Are you ready for that? Victoria's heart was racing as she gazed at the words. She considered her work, her empty routine, her apartment. She reflected on her long-dead mother and her ex-husband, who had relocated to California and remarried. Her life had become smaller and smaller, and she thought about her pals who had slowly faded away. What would she be leaving behind exactly? Yes, I'm ready. Chapter 2. She picked up the pen once more. The crossing. Victoria's bedroom mirror wasn't particularly noteworthy. On the wall across from her bed was a plain rectangular piece of glass in a wooden frame. When she first moved into the flat, she bought it from a furniture store that selected it not because of its beauty, but because of its usefulness. For 3 years, it had mirrored her face every morning, revealing to her the steady deterioration of any youth and hope she had once had, the progressive development of wrinkles around her eyes, and the growing prominence of the gray in her hair. It looked different now, at 2 o'clock in the morning when she stood in front of it. In some way, the glass appeared deeper, as though it had strata that had not previously been. There was a problem with the way her reflection stared back at her, something that made her tummy knot with anticipation and anxiety. Though not particularly younger, the woman in the mirror was youthful enough to be seen. Her eyes were brighter, her skin smoother, and her hair darker. She wore clothing that was unfamiliar to Victoria, including boots that appeared to have been intended for walking through dreams and a long coat that appeared to be composed of shadow and starline. Victoria's reflection mouthed a single word and grinned as she watched. "Come on." When Victoria put her palm against the glass, it went through as though the mirror were composed of water rather than the cold, solid surface she had anticipated. The feeling was beyond description. She seemed to be pushing through a fluid rather than a liquid or gas, as though she were pushing through something quite else. She inhaled deeply before moving forward. The change was like plummeting upward, like being simultaneously upside down and upside down. Victoria was trapped between worlds, between possibilities, and in no place at all for what felt like an eternity. Like a discarded skin, she could feel the weight of her former life slipping away from her, to be replaced by something new and strange. Her feet then made contact with firm ground, and she found herself in a garden that was unlike any she had ever seen. Though it was quite different from what she had anticipated, the shadow garden was just as she had envisioned it. Tall and lean, the tree's rich purple leaves seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. Some sort of luminescent stone, glowing with a gentle pearl-like light, was used to make the pathways. There was no wind to ruffle the petals of the flowers, which bloomed in inconceivable hues like deep, rich blue, silver, and gold. It was impossible to determine if it was dawn or dusk, but the sky above her was the hue of twilight. She could see stars, but they appeared too close, as though she could reach up and pick them like fruit from a tree. Victoria. She noticed them as she turned to face the voice, Lysander and Cordelia, just as she had always imagined them. They had the kind of ethereal beauty that only imaginary beings could possess, and they were maybe 16 or 17, on the brink of childhood and adulthood. Victoria couldn't comprehend the depths of Cordelia's eyes and her long, dark hair, which flowed like water. Lander was taller, with golden hair and features that looked as if they had been chiseled out of marble by someone who knew just how to be both compassionate and strong. Despite their beauty, they were terrified. Victoria could feel the tightness in their bodies, the terror in their eyes, and the way they looked over their shoulders as though something horrible may suddenly appear out of the shadows. Cordelia responded. "You came," and her voice was just as melodious with a hint of steel as Victoria had envisioned. "You might not have. I wasn't sure you would." "Yes, I certainly could," Victoria said, startled by her own voice. Here, it felt deeper, more resonant, as though her words were being amplified by the air itself. "This is impossible. None of this should be real. Reality is more flexible than most people believe," Lysander stated. His voice had a warmth that reminded Victoria of secure harbors and summer evenings, and it was deeper than his sister's. Belief gives them power, and stories shape their own world. "But the Shadow King," Cordelia murmured, her voice decreasing to a whisper. "You've been believing in us for so long that you've made us real. He's real, too, and he's coming." A chilly wind started to blow across the garden as though she had called for him. The inconceivable flowers closed their petals, and the glowing pathways grew dimmer. Above them, the sky grew gloomy, and Victoria sensed something big and evil looming on the outside of her consciousness. Victoria asked, fearing she already knew the answer. What does he want? Lander remarked. He wants to end stories. He seeks to dismantle the link that connects fantasy and reality, to imprison everyone in a world devoid of excitement, optimism, and the potential for magic. He thrives on hopelessness and the times when people lose faith in anything more than the present and ordinary. For years, he has been consuming you, Cordelia said softly. You were alone every night. You went through the motions every day, but you weren't truly alive. Every time you told yourself that stories were just stories and dreams were just dreams. All of that strengthened him. Victoria flushed with embarrassment. I had no idea. I believed that I was simply becoming more realistic as I grew up. The Shadow King is skilled at influencing others to believe that. Leander claimed that he persuades children that magic is immature, that imagination is useless, and that the only things that count are those that can be measured, touched, and placed in a bank account. He causes them to lose sight of the reality of happiness, wonder, and connection, that they are equally significant to everything else. Victoria could hear something in it, and the wind was getting harder now. It sounded like laughter, but it was nasty, icy, and completely without warmth. The outlines of the increasing shadows between the trees were painful to look at directly. What should we do? Victoria inquired. Simply put, we fight, Cordelia remarked. We remind the world that stories matter, that imagination has power, that the connection between reader and character is real and important and worth defending. But in what way? You have the power of belief, of the love you felt for stories and characters and the worlds they inhabit, Lysander continued, referring to the three of us joined across the bridge between worlds, that we have the ability to shape stories, choose how they start, progress, and end, and control narrative. We could take on him together. Now that the laughter was nearer, Victoria could make out the Shadow King stepping out of the shadows between the trees. He was tall and skinny, and every time she tried to look him in the eye, his features seemed to change and move. His smile was the type of expression that caused Victoria's soul to flinch in natural dread, and his eyes were voids of darkness. His voice was the sound of pages being ripped from books, of dreams being dashed, of hope being methodically shattered, of a lonely woman and her fictional friend standing together against the inevitable. He murmured, so touching. Victoria answered, "Do you really think you can stop me?" "We can try." And she was taken aback by how steady her voice was. The luminous pathways flickered like candles in a hurricane as the Shadow King chuckled. "You have no idea why you're fighting. You believe that the goal of this is to save a fictional universe, but it's much more than that. Victoria, I'm giving you freedom. Freedom from the weight of worrying about non-existent things. Freedom from the suffering caused by characters who love you but are unable to return the favor. Liberation from the never-ending cycle of optimism and disappointment that results from having faith in stories." According to Victoria, that isn't freedom. Isn't that death? Victoria could sense the chill emanating from the Shadow King as he moved closer, resembling the heat from a fire. Victoria, take a look at your life. Take a look at the results of your belief. You work in a job that doesn't fulfill you, are divorced, and are alone, residing in an apartment that is less like a home and more like a jail. All of your pals have moved on. Your family has left. Additionally, you read books about fictional characters in the evenings. Is that a living thing? Each of the words struck Victoria with deadly accuracy, as if they were real strikes. Because he was correct, was he not? Her existence was brief, depressing, and meaningless. She had favored fiction over reality and books over people. And where had she ended up? Cordelia said, "Don't listen to him," with urgency. "He's lying. He's trying to make you forget what stories have given you." "What have they given me?" inquired Victoria. And she could hear her own voice slipping into despair. "What have they actually given me?" "They've given you us," Lander replied. "They've taught you that even under the most difficult circumstances, you can be brave, kind, and loving. They've also taught you that you're not alone and that there are people who share your feelings and dreams." The Shadow King mockingly reiterated, "They've given you hope." What a lovely word. What a pointless idea. People are stuck in lives that will never improve because of hope, always anticipating something that will never materialize. I have something far more valuable for you. Acceptance. Recognize that life has no purpose, that tales are unimportant, that the only reality is the one that can be measured, experienced, and demonstrated. Embrace it, and I'll ease the agony of yearning for more. Victoria sensed that she was faltering. She didn't want to acknowledge how alluring the offer was. How much simpler would it be to give up hope, to give up caring, to give up believing in anything other than the daily and immediate? Subsequently, she recalled the music box concealed in her childhood bedroom and the hidden delight she had experienced upon turning it on and witnessing the small ballerina perform. She recalled the evenings she had read under her blankets by flashlight, losing herself in imaginary worlds that seemed more real than her own. In the original story, after Cordelia and Lysander had successfully vanquished the Shadow King, she recalled how her heart had soared, how she had experienced a sense of belonging to something greater and more significant than herself. "No," she responded, her voice now more forceful. "I refuse to accept that. Stories are important and have influenced who I am. Then you've chosen to suffer. You've chosen to keep hoping for things that will never come. You've chosen to keep believing in things that don't exist, to keep living a life that will never be enough." Perhaps, Victoria said, "But I've also chosen to keep loving, to keep dreaming, to keep believing that stories have power. They taught me how to be brave, kind, and hopeful, even when everything seems dark. They showed me that there is more to life than just existing." She turned to Cordelia and Lysander and saw them smiling at her with expressions of pride and love that made her heart swell. "You're real to me. You've always been real to me. And if that makes me crazy, then I'd rather be crazy than empty." The Shadow King let out a shriek of rage that made the very air tremble. "You cannot defeat me. I am the voice that makes me feel good, that tells you that dreams are useless, that stories are just lies, that the only reality is the one that breaks your spirit. But we're the force that reminds people that life is more than just surviving, that there is beauty, wonder, and possibility in the world. We are the reminder that stories matter," Lander added, moving to Victoria's other side, "that the connections we make with characters, worlds, and ideas are real, valuable, and worth fighting for." "And I am the bridge between worlds," Victoria said, understanding pouring through her like sunlight. The three of them clasped hands, and Victoria felt a power that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The power of connection, of shared belief, of the understanding that stories were not escapes from reality, but rather doors into deeper truths. The Shadow King raised his hands, and darkness began to pour from him like water from a broken dam. But the darkness couldn't touch them. The power of their connection, their belief in the importance of stories and dreams and imagination, created a barrier that the Shadow King couldn't cross. "This isn't over," he growled, his form already starting to deteriorate. "People who lose hope, quit believing, and tell themselves that aspirations are pointless will always exist. As long as there are those who prefer despair to wonder, I will always be here. Then we'll be here to fight you no matter what." The Shadow King uttered one last cry of fury and disappeared, taking the darkness and cold with him. Victoria remarked, "Every time someone opens a book, every time someone lets themselves believe in a story, every time someone remembers that there's magic in the world, will be there. With the roads shining brighter than before and the impossible flowers opening their petals to display hues without names, the gardens started to bloom once more." Victoria noticed that Lander and Cordelia were both grinning at her with a look of intense affection and contentment. "It's over," said Cordelia, "and he is no longer there." "Not indefinitely," Lander said. "The connection between realms is safe for the time being, but he will return in some way." Victoria understood and nodded. "What now happened to me? Do I return to my former life?" "You decide that," Cordelia said. "You don't have to go back to your previous life, but you can go back to your planet. You have the option to keep in mind what you have learned here, to live as someone who understands the importance of storytelling, the strength of imagination, and the genuineness and worth of the bonds we form with the things we cherish. According to Lander, you can decide to be the link that reminds people that life is more than merely existing. Believe there is magic, wonder, and beauty. You can find it anywhere in the world. Victoria reflected on her empty routine, her work, and her apartment. She then reflected about the music box, the books, and the happy and awe-inspiring times she had had when she had allowed herself to believe in something more than the present and ordinary. I think I'd like to go back, she continued slowly, but not to hide from the world this time. To impart my knowledge and remind people that stories are important. Both Lander and Cordelia grinned at her. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt a warmth in her chest. Then go, answered Cordelia. However, keep in mind that the bridge between realms is now permanent and that we are always available if you need us. Listener added, you can always come back and we can always visit you in your dreams, in your imagination, in the moments when you're reading and the world falls away and you're completely absorbed in a story. We'll be there. Victoria hugged them both, feeling the warmth of their friendship, the reality of their presence, and the strength of the connection they'd forged before turning back toward the mirror that would take her home. Chapter 3. The Return. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep through her bedroom windows, Victoria emerged from the mirror, half expecting to find herself back in her old life, unchanged and empty, with the adventure in the Shadow Garden being exposed as nothing more than a complex dream. But she was not the same. She felt a lightness in her chest, a clarity in her mind, a sense of purpose that had been so long gone that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. The gray emptiness that had occupied her. Life for years was gone, replaced by something warm and alive and full of possibilities. She looked in the mirror and saw that she was herself again, not the younger, idealized version of herself that had been in the Shadow Garden, but her actual self, 42 years old and marked by experience. However, something was different in her eyes, a light that had not been there before, a spark of wonder and hope that made her appear truly alive for the first time in years. The book was still open on the page where she had written her message to Cordelia and Lysander, but beneath her was a new message in the same shaky handwriting that had filled the last chapter. Thank you, Victoria. You have saved both of our worlds and reminded us all that the connections we make through stories are real, valuable, and worth fighting for. The bridge between worlds is permanent now. You are welcome in our world, and we will always be here for you when you need us. Go now and share what you have learned. Remind others that there is magic in the world if they know how to look for it. With love and gratitude, Cordelia, Lysander, and Evangeline. Victoria smiled and closed the book, then picked up the fountain pen that had somehow become hers. It was still warm to the touch, still vibrating with that strange energy that seemed to connect her to something larger than herself. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, watching the sun rise over Portland through her east-facing window. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the familiar weight of another meaningless day stretching ahead of her. Instead, she felt energized, purposeful, ready to begin something new. She thought about her job at the insurance company, about the endless succession of claims and paperwork and bureaucratic meaninglessness that had defined her working life for the past 5 years. She thought about her coworkers, most of whom seemed as trapped and uninspired as she had been, going through the motions of living without really being alive. Maybe she could change that. Maybe she could find a way to share what she'd learned, to help others remember that there was more to life than just existing, that stories and imagination in the eyes of the businessman on the subway, dreaming of a novel he's been meaning to write for 20 years, in the smile of the child in the park, lost in a game of pretend that seems more real than the adult world around her, in the face of the barista who serves you your coffee, wondering if anyone will ever see past your uniform to the person underneath, in the smile of the child in the park, immersed in a game of pretend that seems more real than the adult world around her. We live in a society that tells us that stories are unimportant, that imagination is a luxury we can't afford, and that the only things worth caring about are the ones that we can measure, quantify, and put in our bank accounts. That we are taught that growing up means giving up wonder, that becoming mature means giving up hope. and that the connections we form with fictional characters and imaginary worlds are somehow less real than those we make in the real world. However, I've discovered that this distinction is untrue. The love you feel for a character in a book is real love. The hope you gain from a story is real hope. The courage you find in the actions of fictional heroes is real courage, and it can be carried into your real life and used to make real changes. Stories are not escapes from reality. Rather, they're windows into deeper truths about what it means to be human, what it means to hope, dream, love, and fight for something better. They teach us empathy by allowing us to see the world from different perspectives. They teach us courage by demonstrating that people can overcome insurmountable obstacles and persevere. They teach us that transformation is possible, that redemption is achievable, and that even the darkest circumstances can be illuminated by the smallest spark of hope. I spent years thinking that my love of stories was somehow insufficient, that I should concentrate on real life and real relationships. However, the truth is that stories had already prepared me for real life, teaching me how to recognize courage, how to value kindness, and how to believe in the possibility of change. I had simply forgotten how to incorporate those lessons into my own life. The bridge between worlds is real and always open. All you need to do is remember that you are worthy of magic, worthy of wonder, and worthy of the kind of transformative love that exists between reader and story. Therefore, don't let anyone tell you that your love of stories is childish, naive, or unimportant. Don't let anyone convince you that imagination is worthless or that wonder is a luxury you can't afford. And don't let anyone tell you that your ability to believe in magic, to see beauty in unlikely places, and to find meaning in metaphor are all real in the ways that matter most. The Shadow King is also present in the voice that tells you to give up hope, to stop dreaming, to accept that life has no purpose. He thrives on despair and gets stronger every time someone loses faith in the power of stories. But he can be defeated again and again every time someone opens a book and allows themselves to be drawn into a world of possibilities. So read, dream, believe, create your own stories, or lose yourself in the stories that others have created. Keep in mind that the person you become when you're engrossed in a good book, one who is hopeful, sympathetic, and open to possibilities, is the real you. That person is who you were meant to be. The magic is real. The bridge is real. The love is real. And you deserve it all. After finishing her writing, Victoria sat back and read what she had written. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and she could feel the truth of it vibrating in her chest like the vibration she'd felt in the fountain pen. She considered what she could do with it. Either start a blog or submit it as an essay to literary magazines, share it on social media, or print copies and leave them in coffee shops and libraries. The goal was to let people know they weren't alone by reaching out to those who might be experiencing similar emotions. But first, she needed to make other changes. That IT was early, but not too early to leave a voicemail saying, "Hello, Patricia. This is Victoria Ashworth. I'm calling to let you know that I'll be giving my 2 weeks notice today. I'll send you a formal letter this morning, but I wanted to give you advance warning so you could start planning for coverage of my accounts. I know this is sudden, but I realized I need to make some significant changes in my life. Thank you for understanding." She hung up, feeling a wave of excitement and fear pass over her. But she had no idea what she would do next. IT was a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a complex that had seen better days, but it could be transformed. She could paint the walls, hang inspirational artwork, create a space that reflected the person she was becoming rather than the person she'd been. And most importantly, she could reach out to people again, even though she didn't have a backup job waiting or significant savings to fall back on. She had something that she hadn't had in years: faith in herself, faith in the possibility of change, and faith that life could be more than a series of pointless days to be endured. College roommate Janet, who lived across the country now, but still sent Christmas cards every year with updates about her family and career. Victoria had never responded to these cards, had convinced herself that too much time had passed, that Janet wouldn't be interested in reconnecting with someone whose life had become so small and unremarkable. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe Janet would be happy to hear from her. Maybe there were others who would welcome her back into their lives if she had the courage to reach out. She opened her laptop again and began composing emails to Janet, to her cousin Ruth in Chicago, to her former colleague Diana, who had tried to maintain their friendship even after Victoria had retreated into isolation. She didn't know if any of them would respond positively, but she was willing to find out. The fountain pen sat on the table beside her laptop, still warm to the touch. Every now and then, as she wrote, she would pick it up and feel that strange vibration, that connection to something larger than herself. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that Cordelia and Lysander were out there in their garden of shadows and lights, that the bridge between worlds was permanent and real. As the morning progressed, Victoria found herself thinking about practical matters. She would need to find new work, something that felt meaningful rather than merely profitable. She thought about the library where she'd spent so many happy hours as a child, about the bookstore downtown that always seemed to be struggling to stay afloat, about the literacy program she'd read about that helped adults learn to read. Maybe she could find a way to work with stories professionally to help others discover the transformative power of reading and imagination. Maybe she could teach or work in publishing or start that blog she'd been thinking about and turn it into something more substantial. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in years, that felt exciting rather than overwhelming. Around noon, her phone rang. Even though she didn't recognize the number, she felt obligated to answer it. "Hello, is this Victoria Ashworth?" "Yes, this is Victoria." The voice was older, female, and had a faint accent that Victoria couldn't identify. "Evelyn Whitmore is my name. You've been reading my grandmother's books, I think." Victoria's breath froze in her throat. "Evangeline Whitmore, your grandmother. The Penumbra Chronicles were written by her. I've been attempting to get in touch with you for a while, but until this morning, I wasn't sure how to do it. I had the most bizarre dream involving a young lady begging me to call you while passing by a mirror and my grandmother's characters." Victoria sat down with a heavy heart. "I don't get it. You got my number, but how?" "I work as a librarian," Evelyn remarked, laughing softly. "When I need someone, I find them in my own manner. I recalled that you had inquired about my grandmother's other works in a letter you had sent us years prior. Most likely, you can't recall. It would have been a long time ago. More significantly, though, I have something that is yours. Or, more accurately, something my grandmother left especially for you." "For myself? However, that isn't feasible. Your grandmother is someone I have never met. I have no idea when she passed away." Evelyn stated that she passed away in 1987. However, she gave detailed instructions on what to do in the event that our family was contacted over the Penumbra Chronicles. She added that a woman named Victoria would require our assistance at some point, and we ought to offer her what she had left behind on that day. The world seemed to be tilting around Victoria. What was it she left behind? Evelyn stated it was a manuscript. She never published the 8th book in the series because she stated it wasn't yet time. "You'll know when it's time to share it with the world," she remarked. Victoria felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she closed her eyes. "You're where?" "Actually, I live in Salem, Massachusetts, which is roughly 20 minutes from your childhood home. Would you be open to meeting with me? I realize this is all extremely unusual. I believe you should know more about my grandma, the books, and how they ended up in your life at a time when you needed them most." Victoria reflected on her meaningless life in Portland, the job she had recently departed, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Then she remembered the fountain pen on her table, still heated, regarding the everlasting bridge that connected planets and Genuine, on the potential that all of this was a part of a bigger narrative that she was just now starting to comprehend. "Yes," she said, "I'll be there. If I drive through the night, I can get there by tomorrow." "Wonderful," said Evelyn, and the joy in her voice was audible to Victoria. "I'll text my address to you. Welcome home, Victoria." After hanging up, Victoria took another glance around her flat. To tie up the loose threads of her previous life, she would have to pack and find someone to manage the lease. She wasn't sad to go, though. Portland has served as a haven from a world that navigating that had appeared too difficult. She was no longer hiding, though. To find out the remainder of her story, she was heading home. As Victoria started packing, she reflected on the music box in her childhood bedroom, the books that influenced her creativity, and the person she had been before disappointment and fear had led her to doubt the existence of magic. She was still there. She understood that she had only been awaiting authorization to come out. Still heated and pulsing with enigmatic energy, the fountain pen was placed in her purse. She'd be prepared for whatever came next. She had discovered that imagination was real, that stories had power, and that reader-character relationships were just as significant and legitimate as any other form of love. One way or another, the Shadow King would be back. He did. However, Victoria would also be prepared for him, equipped with the understanding that awe was not a sign of weakness, optimism was not naivete, and that if enough people remembered to believe in it, the magic that existed in stories might change the world. Even though she was heading into an uncertain future, she no longer feared it. The best stories she had discovered always started with a character entering an unknown space through a doorway, and she was at last prepared to find out what was beyond. Victoria Ashworth was returning home to discover what it meant that the bridge between realms was genuine and permanent. Conclusion. 6 months later, Victoria Ashworth's blog Bridges Between Worlds continues the story. Today is the Penumbra Chronicles Library's 6th anniversary, and I wanted to express my opinions on our joint accomplishments and future plans. For those who are unfamiliar with our community, the library started out as a tiny lending business out of my grandmother's home in Salem, Massachusetts. To be clear, my grandmother wasn't actually my grandmother, but Evelyn Whitmore hasn't ever since become family. The Penumbra Chronicles and a few dozen other carefully picked books were our starting point. They were all chosen because they served as powerful reminders to readers that magic exists and that stories have power. We've grown into something much more. Today, we operate a network of more than 50 small, free libraries throughout New England. Each one is filled with literature that locals have nominated as being especially meaningful or transformational. We've held reading gatherings in community centers, coffee shops, and libraries. Our new Pen Pal initiative pairs young readers with grown-ups who have similar childhood book preferences. In order to assist people in finding their own voices, telling their own stories, and discovering their own magic, we have created writing workshops. Our most significant accomplishment, however, is demonstrating that the desire for wonder and connection is still present and just has to be stoked. People who have regained their love of reading, who have the guts to write their own stories, and who have realized that creativity is a need rather than a luxury, send me notes every week. There is still the Shadow King out there. Of course, I frequently hear him in the voices that tell us that we're being unrealistic, that stories are merely ways to escape reality, and that we should spend our time on useful things rather than squandering it on books, fantasies, and fantasy. However, I've discovered that he is not as strong as he would have us think, that a person becomes a little weaker each time he chooses curiosity over cynicism, hope over despair, and connection over isolation. I won't give away the plot, but I will say that it has altered my perception of what true heroism entails. It's more than just defending kingdoms and battling monsters. It's about making the decision to think that life can be lovely, meaningful, and full of opportunities every single day. It's about creating connections between your inner and outward selves, between the magic you discover in stories and the magic you make in your own life, between who you are and who you can become. As I write this, the fountain pen that began this entire adventure is resting on my desk, still heated, still pulsing with enigmatic vitality that I occasionally believe I can hear voices in it. Lysander and Cordelia, of course, but others as well. Every character who has ever held significance for someone. Every writer whose words have ever transformed a life. Every reader who has ever realized they are not alone. Everyone is welcome to use the actual bridge that connects worlds. You only need to keep in mind that you are deserving of wonder, magic, and the kind of transforming love that exists between a reader and a story. With love and thankfulness, the journey is just getting started. Victoria, believe that sensation if you're reading this and you're experiencing that familiar jolt of recognition. The idea that life may be more than what you're going through right now. The bridge, the love, and the magic are all real, and you deserve them all. And with that, another night full of stories from the shadows comes to a close. I want to express my gratitude to everyone that stayed with me through this voyage into the unknown. These gloomy tales seem a bit less lonely with your presence, and I sincerely appreciate that you decided to spend the evening with me. I hope you have found the perfect balance of curiosity and terror in these stories. The fact that we can all congregate in the dark, united by our shared appreciation of a good scare, is incredibly unsettling. And I sincerely hope that the stories told tonight struck a chord with you as the same way they treated me. More riddles and shivers await you when I return tomorrow night. Thus, I'm hoping I'll see you again. Until then, get a good night's sleep, dream quietly, and avoid the stories from tonight will follow you into your dreams. However, if they do, keep in mind, after all, they are but stories. Dream sweet dreams. Buddy, I'll see you tomorrow at evening.